The speakers today will be, after Mr. LaRouche, will be Anton Chaikin. Mark Calney, unfortunately, is ill and will not be here. However, his speech will be read for him by Khushro Gandhi, especially if he's here. Oh, there he is. Good. Good timing. Mike Minicino, Jeff Steinberg, and Kathleen Klanetsky. One of the most, among them, perhaps one of the most formidable collection of people who have developed the ideas and the exposés and the information and the analysis which has driven terror into the hearts of our enemies, and I think you'll see why as a result of the presentations which they make to you today. So, without further ado, if Charles has Lynn's tape ready, I would like to begin with that.
Recently, there was a letter and accompanying document attacking me, issued by the Supreme Commander of the Southern Jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, one C. Fred Kleinknecht. The issue which the document addresses explicitly is my proposal to remove from its position on U.S. government property in Washington, D.C., the ugly statue of a traitor, a war criminal, a racist, and a satanic degenerate, General Albert Pike, who was one of the leading predecessors of Mr. Kleinknecht as Sovereign Supreme Commander of the Southern Jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Moreover, Mr. Pike, General Pike as he's sometimes called, is the author of a book called Morals and Dogma, which by many members of the Scottish Rite in the United States is considered a virtual Bible, or at least the anti-Bible of that section of Freemasonry. And that book, Morals and Dogma, is a book consistent with the satanic religious beliefs explicitly adopted and advocated by General Pike. General Pike, of course, was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. That is not disputable on the basis of the evidence in hand, though Mr. Kleinknecht proposes disputed. What I wish to do here at this moment is to identify the nature of the core or characteristic issue at stake between me and the fellow who has engaged me publicly for this debate, Sovereign Supreme Commander C. Fred Kleinknecht. As the letters of Albert Pike to Giuseppe Mazzini illustrate the point, Pike, like Mazzini, was a Satanist, and like Mazzini, was an instrument of a circle in London headed or associated prominently with Lord Palmerston, the author of Opium Wars Against China, among his other virtues. The object of Pike's endeavor, and that of Palmerston and also Mazzini, was to destroy the United States, a continuing commitment since our War of Independence to destroy the United States, this time by means of fomenting a division of the nation between one part of the nation controlled by the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite and other parts of the nation. This conspiracy of traitors, and they were all in the leadership, conscious traitors to the United States, that is, agents acting as agents of a Britain which used them in an effort called the Civil War or the Secession to destroy the United States by dismembering it and thus making the entire Western Hemisphere virtually a colony of the British Empire. So these people were not honest rebels, they were traitors. This party of Treason was born in the Tory British sympathizers of the period of the American War of Independence. And because of a treaty arrangement, these people who were traitors in effect to the United States then stayed behind in large part and formed what became the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry in its modern form within the United States. They were famous as the slave traders. They were famous as the partners of the British East India Company, i.e. Lord Palmerston, Britain, in running opium principally into China. The Lowell family, for example, which George Bundy is descended, was part of this gang of treasonously inclined opium traders. They were the Perkins Syndicate of Salem, Massachusetts, which a lot of the Massachusetts blue blood families, so-called, were derived their wealth from. And they were also part of the Russell Syndicate out of Russell and Company in Connecticut. The Russell and Company, which is the controlling interest from then, early in the 19th century, to the present day, at Yale University, which gave us, of course, such things as George Bush. And these people were notorious in 1814 as having been part of the British agent Burr's conspiracy to destroy the United States. They were part of what was called the Hartford Convention of 1814, a conspiracy by traitors to the United States, and they were outright traitors, to destroy the United States. The failure of this treason in 1814 led to the new conspiracy to divide the United States into two parts by secession, one a southern group of states committed to slavery, and the other a northern group of states committed to abolition of slavery. Though the Northerners, such as the Lowell family of George Bundy's ancestors, while objecting to slavery in Massachusetts, did not object to it in the South. In fact, they benefited greatly from the use of slave-produced cotton for the New England cotton mills, like Friedrich Engels, the scoundrel whose wealth was derived from the use of slave cotton in England. After the Civil War, with the execution of Lincoln by circles which were associated with the treasonous southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite, and with its B'nai B'rith offshoot, which is the racist, treasonous and racist section of American Judaism, a very small minority of American Judaism at the time, Lincoln was assassinated by these people and their friends, and a more agreeable president, at least from the standpoint of the traitor standpoint, Andrew Johnson became president. As a result of a number of developments leading into the election of such atrocities as Confederate sympathizers, Teddy Roosevelt, whose ideas were shaped by his uncle, a Confederate traitor, Bullock, and the Confederate president, that is the Confederate who became president, Woodrow Wilson, who, among other things, incidentally co-sponsored the founding or refounding of the Ku Klux Klan in 1915. This nation was gradually taken over by the same group of people, the same group of racist traitors who formed the Confederacy earlier. To this date, the internal history of the United States and the conflict in the United States position in the world as a ally of British imperialism and similar evil enterprises has been based on a takeover of more and more of the institutions of the United States by the circles associated with the leadership of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. These are the racists. These are the authors of the accomplices of those who set forth two world wars in this century. These are the people who committed all of the atrocities against the peoples of the Caribbean region of South and Central America from the United States. These are the people who have trampled upon our Constitution, who have trampled upon our economy by introducing things like the Federal Reserve System and so forth. These are the actual enemies of the United States, not because of although each is accountable in his own person for what he does. The essence of the matter is this association of people who are in the tradition of Palmerston, Pike, and Mazzini in leading institutions of the United States. Those who are in the tradition of the drug runners of the Perkins Syndicate and Russell Company today. So therefore, I'm very happy that C. Fred Kleinknecht has chosen to attack me so frequently and so violently by name, and to seek to mobilize all Freemasonic officers and through lodges throughout the country in the general mobilization against me. Because this indicates that the Freemasons recognize that those Freemasons in particular, recognize that we have become a significant threat to their power, chiefly by our raising during my presidential campaign together with the Reverend Bevel, the issue of the Pike statue. Either, if the statue comes down, that of course injures the interest of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. No question about it. However, if the Scottish Rite, aided by its Anti-Defamation League agents, were to succeed in preventing our efforts to pull down the statue, this would result in a much greater damage to the Scottish Rite by the following means. Let me call your attention to a book which is fairly famous in military history, which contains an apt description of the foolish situation into which Mr. Kleinknecht has maneuvered himself recently. This book is by the great German strategist, military strategist, von Schlieffen, and its title is Cannae, and it deals not only with the Battle of Cannae in which Hannibal defeated the Romans, but it deals with the principle of the theory of the flank throughout military history, including an examination of the genius of one of America's greatest military figures, General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was the hammer that beat the Confederacy military force into a pulp on the anvil provided by Sherman's collaborator, General Grant. At Cannae, to make short, the Roman forces, which outnumbered the Carthaginians and their allies, formed a compact mass to assault the Carthaginians. In point of fact, they over-concentrated what was, for that period of time, their firepower. The military genius, Hannibal, exploited this mistake of the Romans of concentrating their firepower to the fore by flanking them and reducing a superior military force, that is the Roman force, to a shattered remnant in a battle which remained decisive for a long period thereafter, although Hannibal himself was ultimately defeated for different reasons. What Kleinknecht and his associates have done is to commit the same kind of folly in the political domain that the Roman commanders committed leading to their defeat at the Battle of Cannae. That is, they concentrated their forces, including the ADL, and their stooges even within the civil rights movement, to defend the statue at all costs. In so doing, they over-concentrated their forces toward the front and invited an attack upon their flank. Let me explain it this following way. What they've done, instead of giving up the Pike statue, which they should have done from the standpoint of elementary military and analogous reasoning, is to stake everything on holding it. And that is one sure way in military circles to ensure one's own defeat, or the likelihood of one's own defeat. First, they put the ADL out there in front. They said, as they said explicitly, they were not going to come out and take me on publicly, but rather they were going to use their stooge, the Anti-Defamation League, which has always been a stooge of the treasonous section of the Scottish Rite in America. They were going to use the ADL to deal with this issue. Well, the ADL was in a pickle. Not only is Pike the founder and represents the spiritual essence of the Ku Klux Klan, both in its first and second incarnations, but the ADL itself, through the B'nai B'rith, was a co-founder of the original Ku Klux Klan, and the ADL in its own right was a participant in the second founding, or the second coming, of the Ku Klux Klan in 1915. There was a link between the two in the person of Simon Wolf, who was a key intelligence operative for the B'nai B'rith, working with the assassins of Abraham Lincoln back during the 1860s, and the very same Simon Wolf, who lived until the 1920s, who was instrumental in bringing about the founding of the second coming of the Ku Klux Klan with the sponsorship of Woodrow Wilson in 1915. So the ADL currently, which pretends to be anti-racist, although it is racist and has a racist philosophy, has been campaigning around the country using the disgust against the Ku Klux Klan as a basis for presenting itself, the ADL, as the major defender of American virtue against the Ku Klux Klan. Now, it was very foolish of the Scottish Rite to propose that this Anti-Defamation League, this ADL, which purportedly is attacking the Klan in every legislature in the country, should come out in Washington, D.C. and around the country in defense of the founder of the Klan, that racist, traitorous, satanic degenerate, General Albert Pike, or at least Pike's statue. So the ADL found itself in difficulty, and the ADL could not, therefore, politically carry out the job which the Scottish Rite headquarters had assigned to it. Thus, because of resolutions around the country, in city councils and so forth, demanding the pulling down of this statue, the Scottish Rite decided that it had to come out in its own name. One of the associated reasons for the sensitivity of the Scottish Rite at this time was the fact that last year, the Southern Baptist Convention entertained a motion to ban membership in the non-Christian satanic Scottish Rite from members of the Baptist congregations. The banning did not occur, however, a resolution was successfully passed which proposed an investigation of the matter, a series of hearings, so to speak, which may be pursuant to reconsidering a motion to ban the Scottish Rite. So the Scottish Rite is very sensitive, and since it has about an estimated 1 million of the members of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite are in the Baptist communion, thus there's a very grave threat to the power of the Scottish Rite, the backers of the drug pusher and scoundrel Oliver North of Iran-Contra notoriety. So my attack on the Scottish Rite's Pike at this time opened up a weak flank in the entirety of the treasonous cabal which it represents, the Confederate tradition which it represents. And therefore, we are now in a position to do the following. Klein, Knecht and Company have adopted the provably treasonous, satanic, degenerate Pike as their own. Not merely from the past as a matter of tradition, but they have adopted him as something which they have to defend today. They've defended his work, they defended his ideas, and thus they have identified themselves with those ideas which their own library identifies Pike as advocating. They've also identified themselves as defending or apologizing for the crimes which Pike committed while he was alive. And thus they have put the stain of treason, Pike's treason, the stain of Satanism, Pike's Satanism, and the stain of satanic degeneracy in general upon themselves as an organization until they shall repudiate it. In the meantime, the major campaign of the visible public campaign of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite since the 1940s has been to serve the cause of Satan exactly as General Pike advocated by attempting to destroy Christianity in the United States, while pretending to believe, of course, in the supreme being, just as Robespierre, the butcher of the French Revolution, professed his belief in the supreme being, and he was, of course, a Freemason, essentially of the same philosophical origins as the southern jurisdiction. The way this was done was by a former Ku Klux Klan member, who was actually still secretly a member of the Ku Klux Klan, Chief Justice Hugo Black of the Supreme Court, who introduced and led in introducing measures leading to the so-called separation of church and state. In effect, these Freemasons got God out of the schools and got Satan or Lucifer in. And if you don't believe it, you can go to many a secondary school today and otherwise and see it. You can see the insistence that homosexuality be taught as a mandatory course of instruction to first graders in various school systems around the world, around the country. And we see promotion of these same general directions and ideas by the Anti-Defamation League, a branch of the Scottish Rite, with its World of Difference program. It should also be noted that the Anti-Defamation League, like the Scottish Rite, publicly proclaims its commitment to this anti-Christian satanic campaign as part of its long-going, on-standing commitment. So what Plankenest has done is he's put all his troops in concentration toward the front, all his firepower to the front to defend the statue of Pike. In so doing, he has shown his organization's commitment to Pike, which permits those of us who are alert to take a leaf out of the book of Hannibal and attack the flanks of this organization, to expose it for what it is, or rather to point out what it has self-exposed itself publicly to be. This is not simply a quarrel with the southern jurisdiction, of course. This is our effort to get at, to uproot, to expose, and to weaken the pernicious, the treasonous, the satanic influence which the institution of the Confederacy, called the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite, has had to the present day in shaping the United States. Thank you very much.
I have been asked by those who are filming this event to tread water for a couple of seconds while they change tapes. So I'll use the occasion to point out that Lynn, as usual, is good to his word. He spoke 20 minutes. So much for treading water. I think we can now proceed. Our next speaker, Anton Chaikin, known to most of us as Tony Chaikin, is considered by some, or known perhaps best to some, as a historian and investigative journalist, the author of Treason in America and co-author with Webster Tarpley of George Bush, the unauthorized biography. In fact, it is believed by some that that book alone has struck fear into the hearts of many potential presidents of the United States, and they're terrified and have rejected the office because they fear the biography that may be written about them by Tony and Webster. There are no indications that Lynn is concerned. But these are really not the principal attributes of Anton Chaikin. I really think that the most important thing that people need to know about him is that we are standing or seated before an accused statue climber.
I recently got a present, which I have to show you because this is going to help us a lot. Can you see it? It's the Masonic symbol with a no on it. Right? Yeah. I think this is probably illegal on television, so if they show this, we'll probably have to take it off. I'll wear it later on. The master of Italian Freemasonry and terrorism, Giuseppe Mazzini, supposedly wrote a letter in 1870 to Masonic chief and KKK founder Albert Pike. The subject was how to coordinate world Freemasonry from the top. And it includes these words, quote, "We must create a supreme rite which shall remain secret, into which shall be called those Masons of high degree whom we shall select. Vis-a-vis the other brothers of the Masonry, we must demand utter secrecy. Through this supreme rite, we shall govern the Masonry, which will thus become the international center, all the more powerful that its leadership shall be unknown." The anti-Mason Margiotta wrote that this supermasonry was in fact created with directorates in North America, Uruguay, Naples, and Calcutta. And Albert Pike supposedly wrote a letter to Mazzini in 1871 proposing that they provoke a, quote, "formidable social cataclysm for the purpose of conquering atheistic communism and Christianity by making them exterminate each other," unquote, which would lead to the desired satanic despotism. It is also alleged that in 1889, Pike told higher Masons to worship Lucifer in preference to the other god whose power balances Lucifer. The Scottish Rite Masons themselves present these particular Mazzini and Pike formulations to the public and deny them as forgeries. The British Museum has said carefully that, quote, "a search of the indexes of our catalogues has failed to disclose any letter in the Department of Manuscripts from Albert Pike to Mazzini," unquote. Justice will one day bring us direct physical access to their archives and to any surviving incriminating writings. But we can demonstrate from their acknowledged writings and from historical facts that even if these quotes are forged, they represent exactly the thought and the actions of Pike and Mazzini. Pike wrote the following in his book, Morals and Dogma, writing about top-down organization, quote, "The blue, or lower, degrees are but the outer court of the temple. Part of the symbols are displayed there to the initiate, but he is intentionally misled by false interpretations. It is not intended that he shall understand them, but it is intended that he shall imagine he understands them. Their true explication is reserved for the adepts, the princes of Masonry," unquote. Writing about the satanic balance, Pike wrote, quote, "Manus, founder of the Manichaeans, who had lived and been distinguished among the Persian Magi, profited by the doctrines of Scythianus, a Kabbalist of the times of the apostles. Manus taught that there are two gods, one of good and the other of evil, each independent, eternal, chief of a distinct empire. The evil god, Satan, is the genius of matter alone. The supreme being, that is the other god, was too pure to come in immediate contact with matter. The prince of darkness made Adam, whose soul was of the divine light and his body of matter, so that he belonged to both empires. The demons created Eve, who seduced him into an act of sensualism that enfeebled him and bound him anew in the bonds of matter. This is repeated in the case of every man that lives. And of course, ladies are not permitted in Masonic lodges. The royal secret of which you are the prince is the secret of the universal equilibrium, that equilibrium between good and evil and light and darkness. Unquote. Then, reflecting on decades of terrorist crimes which Pike and Mazzini had directed, Pike wrote, quote, "Men are but the automata, or robots, of Providence, and Providence uses the demagogue, the fanatic, and the knave as its tools and instruments to effect that of which they do not dream, and which they imagine themselves commissioned to prevent." Unquote. The Scottish Rite, as a project of our British enemies, was started during the American Revolution, principally by two men, a nominal Christian and a nominal Jew. British General Augustine Prevost conquered Charleston, South Carolina, and set up a secret police apparatus there, which became the Scottish Rite headquarters after the British Army left South Carolina. Simultaneously, Moses Michael Hayes started in Rhode Island a Masonic core group of Kabbalistic Jews who were millionaires in the Negro slave trade. Among them were the Lopez and De Leon families. Hayes was himself a banking partner of the highest Massachusetts Anglo-Saxon blue blood Tories, who were all in the slave trade. And they would soon plunge into the opium trade. These elements formed the Scottish Rite. Kabbalism, as opposed to biblical Judaism, came into Rhode Island and South Carolina from the Jewish quarter of the island of Curacao, the Dutch West India Company's slave concentration camp. Slave owners and traders, only nominal Christians or Jews, were forced to flee Caribbean black slave revolts in the 1790s. These embittered Satanists joined the Scottish Rite leadership in Charleston and New Orleans. In Haiti, hereditary slave master Count Alexandre de Grasse led the French planters in their bloody 4-year war against resistant blacks. De Grasse fled to Charleston, where he co-founded the Scottish Rite Mother Lodge in 1801. De Grasse then went back to help lead Napoleon's military campaign against Haiti's independence, a vicious race war which he lost. De Grasse set up the Scottish Rite in British Jamaica in 1803 to help the British govern their 3 million slaves on that island. Under Napoleon in 1804, this genocidalist de Grasse created a Supreme Council for France. De Grasse established the Scottish Rite Supreme Council in Milan in 1805, 2 months before Napoleon came there to be declared King of Italy. This is the origin of the Pike-Mazzini Masonry in Italy. Representing British power, the faction of Masonry opposed to Franklin and Lafayette, de Grasse remained head of the Scottish Rite in France after the fall of Napoleon. Giuseppe Mazzini was a young Italian Freemasonic revolutionist in the 1820s when the British picked him up for their irregular warfare against Europe and America. Mazzini moved to England in the 1830s. From the safety of British upper-class houses he directed anarchists and terrorists to their deaths against the governments and the church. Mazzini's movements became known as Young Italy, Young Germany, Young Switzerland, Young Russia, and then Young America, and B'nai B'rith, and later on, Young Serbia. Many top British strategists employed Mazzini, beginning with Viscount Palmerston. Mazzini was associated with the schemes of Sir John Bowring, it's B-O-W-R-I-N-G, who tried to stop Germany from industrializing on the American system nationalist program of Alexander Hamilton and Friedrich List. Bowring's other protege, Friedrich Engels, threatened would-be German manufacturers with insurrection to be led by Karl Marx and Mazzini. Bowring's free trade subversion career took him to China, where Bowring started the Second Opium War and organized a communist insurrection led by a messianic Chinese Protestant cult. It was the Taiping Rebellion. Mazzini led Britain's 1848 revolution in Italy, directed against the Catholic Church and designed to stop the Vatican from leading the nationalist movement. In 1852, the U.S. Democratic Party's national magazine said that the new Young America regime of President Franklin Pierce must back Giuseppe Mazzini in the overthrow of Europe's governments. The publisher of the Democratic magazine, George Sanders, a paid agent of British bankers, also called for the USA to seize Cuba and Haiti and secure black slavery under North American rule. As Mazzini's U.S. mouthpiece, Sanders declared that, quote, "this continent is for white people," unquote. But note that Mazzini has even now a false reputation as an anti-slavery activist. President Franklin Pierce had been privately selected as the Democratic nominee by Scottish Rite boss John Quitman, the son of Curaçao slave masters, and by Boston opium lord Caleb Cushing, the sponsor of Albert Pike as his rise to power in Arkansas. Mazzini wrote about his own role in the Pierce election. Quote, Mazzini says, "I am working with the very numerous Germanic element in the United States for his election, and under certain conditions which Pierce has accepted. He was to appoint American representatives in Europe who would be favorable to us and would help us. And almost all his nominations are such as we desired. He was to give to his battleship commanders instructions opposed to Austria and the despotic governments. He has done it. He had promised to give orders to all his diplomatic agents to recognize immediately whatever insurrectionary Republican government should be established in Italian or Hungarian province. And he states that he has done so. This is Mazzini talking about his role in affecting the election of President Pierce and what he's getting in return. President Pierce appointed George Sanders consul in London, where Sanders hosted in his home Mazzini's entire crew of revolutionists. They made that place their headquarters. Other open Mazziniites, such as Edwin de Leon and Scottish Rite bankroller August Belmont, got top diplomatic posts, while Pike's sponsor Cushing ran the Pierce administration as Attorney General of the United States. Operating at that time in Switzerland, Mazzini was assured by the U.S. ambassador there that if Mazzini were arrested, he would be immediately taken under the ambassador's protection. This is what Mazzini says in his letters to the English family that he's staying with. Under this Pierce regime, the Scottish Rite prepared a slave owners' war on the USA. Whitman sent the new Scottish Rite member Albert Pike to live in Louisiana in 1855. Pike developed the New Orleans base of the anti-Catholic, anti-black terrorist group, the Knights of the Golden Circle. Pike worked with Caribbean Jewish Kabbalist Judah Benjamin and the strange British agent Catholics who would pave the way for the introduction of Mazzini's Mafia in New Orleans. Within the overall movement to unify Italy, Mazzini worked to create new instruments for crime and covert dictatorship. In 1860, Mazzini sent just 1,000 red shirts under General Garibaldi to invade Sicily. Sicily was then ruled by Bourbon royalty. Now, how did such a small force succeed? These Sicilian mafia, by then ruled by Mazzini's command, crippled the government's response from within Sicily. But to make sure, the British Navy moved into position to protect the landing of the 2 ships that were sent down from Genoa. And Sicily was conquered. That same year, with Albert Pike as commander, in 1860, the Scottish Rite marshaled the slave owners' political leaders, secured the backing of British bankers Rothschild and Baring, and launched the secession of the U.S. South. The 1850s Mazziniite regime of Franklin Pierce now became the 1860s insurrectionary government. Pierce's Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, was the Confederate president. Judah Benjamin, as Confederate Secretary of State, directed the Scottish Rite espionage networks, with George Sanders and Edwin de Leon running on British funds between Canada and Europe. While British shipyards built cruisers for the Confederacy to sink the U.S. merchant marine, pro-Confederate English politicians got Mazzini's main public spokesman, Sir James Stansfeld, appointed Lord of the Admiralty. This is in the middle of the American Civil War. The United States won the Civil War, but its nationalist president, Abraham Lincoln, was murdered by the Pike-Benjamin Secret Service. At Ford's Theater, where John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln, the National Park Service displays a decoding sheet found by the police in Booth's trunk and a matching coding device found in the office of Judah Benjamin. Albert Pike was hiding in British Canada, wanted for treason by this country, when the new Masonic president, Andrew Johnson, issued him a pardon. The nationalist leader of the U.S. Congress, Thaddeus Stevens, a fierce opponent of Freemasonry, launched Reconstruction to overthrow the Southern oligarchy and to ensure rights to the blacks newly freed from slavery. Albert Pike restarted the terrorist Knights of the Golden Circle, calling it the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, which fought Reconstruction with satanic costumes and rituals and murders. The Scottish Rite, their home base in South Carolina, was conquered by General Sherman, and it remained for years under a regime of talented and patriotic black leaders. This is after the Civil War, including Amelia Robinson's great uncle, U.S. Congressman Robert Smalls. In the late 1870s, the Pike KKK forces ran phony scandals to overthrow these black leaders, corruption scandals. The former slave owners then seized control of South Carolina. And I have seen on display in Charleston the startling Mazziniite red shirt uniforms that these vigilante forces wore when they lynched and tortured and shot their way back into power in South Carolina. Thus, Mazzini and Pike corresponded. Mazzini created the secret Propaganda Uno Lodge, which ruled Italy for many decades. Pike and Mazzini co-founded the Scottish Rite organizations of Latin America. Mazzini's mafia spread into New Orleans. So the Jewish and Italian mafiosi who have nested there in New Orleans are the queer Masonic birds whose parents and continuing controllers are these ultra-racists that we have described. Their hemisphere-wide dope trafficking is in fact intended to exterminate Christianity. The Propaganda Due, or P2 Lodge, was established on the Mazzini model by the Anglo-Americans after World War II. In cooperation with communist secret services, the Scottish Rite P2 has run terrorism against the nation of Italy. Italian police trying to penetrate the Masonic control of criminal terrorism recently ran up against the covert Albert Pike Lodge in Calabria. Though now officially outlawed, P2, set up by the Anglo-Americans, is spearheading the current crusade to scandalize, dismember, and subjugate Italy. The heirs of Pike and Mazzini are the new KKK, the neo-Nazis hammering at Germany. Dennis Mahon, the Oklahoma KKK leader and naval intelligence operative who trains young German neo-Nazis, admits that he works with the Stasi, secret police, the former communist Stasi, to wreck Germany, that is today. And Mahon praises KKK founder Albert Pike as a pioneer 19th century environmentalist. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, who heads up a neo-Nazi unit of the United States Army, is the high priest of the Satanic Temple of Set, the officially recognized satanic religion in the U.S. Army. An up-to-date Pike-Mazzini team has worked on behalf of Britain's strategy of tension against Germany. The neo-Nazis are run by the High Mason Aquino and by intelligence chiefs William Webster and Ted Shackley, and by Kabbalist mobster Edgar Bronfman. So this is the neo-Nazi operation in Germany. Now that the Scottish Rite is panicking and coming out into the open to defend their KKK, we should recommend to law enforcement officials everywhere, watch the Masonic offices for smoke. They may soon be burning their private papers, and we shall want those papers rescued to aid in future prosecutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. As you can see, a completely unrepentant statue climber. Our next presentation is from Mark Calney. Mark is not with us today. He is sick. Many of you know him as a researcher and author. He has written a recent New Federalist series of articles on the subject of today's presentation, which is D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, Hollywood and the KKK. Mark's paper will be read for us by Khushro Gandhi.
On the evening of March 24th, 3 days from now, PBS television will premiere a documentary entitled D.W. Griffith, Father of Film. The highlight of this fawning tribute to Griffith is his film Birth of a Nation. This is occurring at the same time that a fight has broken out, led by the NAACP, to prevent the U.S. Library of Congress from placing Birth of a Nation into its prestigious National Film Registry. NAACP Chairman Gibson has recently stated, quote, "We do not believe in censorship and therefore accept the idea of preserving this film for future scholars, historians, and educators. We feel the film can be preserved, however, without adding it to the National Film Registry or cloaking it in any mantle of distinction or honor. Those who view this D.W. Griffith work must be fully aware of what this film was and what it was meant to be, a distorted, dishonest propaganda recruiting vehicle for the Ku Klux Klan members and sympathizers." The release of Griffith's 1915 motion picture, Birth of a Nation, originally entitled The Klansman, was that vehicle which created two closely related phenomena. First, a revival of the Ku Klux Klan as a mass-based organization in the United States. And second, the establishment of Hollywood as the new Babylon of modern culture. Hollywood as an institution did not begin as an innocent collection of artsy filmmakers, but that somehow was taken over and corrupted in recent times. It was rotten at its inception. The Birth of a Nation presented a rewriting of the actual history of Reconstruction by the same Confederate traitors against whom the war had been fought. It portrayed African Americans in the post-Civil War South as depraved, lascivious beasts whose rampant lawlessness and alleged domination of the South through military force and control of courts and state legislatures threatened to destroy Southern civilization and mongrelize the races. The film glorifies the lynchings and reign of terror carried out by the new secret order of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. These twin evils, Hollywood and the KKK, come from the circle of elite Anglo-Americans who were the direct heirs, philosophically and often physically, of the old Confederacy. And they are the same treasonous scoundrels who organized the entry of the United States into the First World War on the side of the British Empire, and the establishment of the Versailles system at the end of that war. The creation of the Klan in 1865 and its later revival at the beginning of this century was not a spontaneous phenomenon. In both cases, we find the guiding hand of those individuals and institutions, such as the Scottish Rite Masonic Order, who have always opposed the Republican principles upon which the U.S. was founded. The initiating ceremony reviving the Klan occurred on Thanksgiving Eve of 1915, atop Stone Mountain, just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, when a small group of men, which included former members of the original Klan, followed the new Klan leader, Colonel William J. Simmons, in a cross-burning ritual. That spectacle coincided with the opening presentation of Birth of a Nation 1 week later, also in Atlanta. Announcements of the film debut in the local newspaper were accompanied by Colonel Simmons' proclamation of the establishment of a new, invisible empire of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Birth of a Nation was literally a recruitment film for the KKK, and the target of its revival was not principally the South, but was the old Union strongholds of the North. Griffith's 2-hour and 45-minute motion picture brazenly promoted the ideas of white race supremacy. This dovetailed with the ongoing British Empire campaign of eugenics, the so-called race science, which found its most enthusiastic sponsors among such Anglo-American financiers as John D. Rockefeller and Averell Harriman. The central theme of Anglo-Saxon supremacy was the vehicle used to recruit large numbers of members into the Klan. Give the transparency. By 1923, the high water mark of Klan recruitment, the Klan's active membership was estimated at 1.5 million. The total number of members enrolled from 1915 to 1944 has been estimated at over 2 million. As you can see from the chart, the majority of Klan members were in the northern states, with the largest base of support in any one city being Chicago, with 20 Klan chapters totaling 50,000 members. D.W. Griffith's film, Birth of a Nation, was based on a 1905 book written by Thomas Dixon, Jr., titled The Klansman, an historic romance of the Ku Klux Klan. and which he dedicated to the memory of a Scottish-Irish leader, this is a quote, of the South, my uncle, Colonel Leroy McTee, Grand Titan of the Ku Klux Klan. Dixon considered himself the great defender of the Anglo-Saxon race, claiming that the beginning of Negro equality is the beginning of the end of this nation's life. Dixon was born in Shelby, North Carolina in 1864. In the 1880s, Dixon attended Johns Hopkins University, and while there became a close friend of another Southerner, a Virginian by the name of Woodrow Wilson, who would play an important role in the future of Birth of a Nation. It was as a Baptist minister that Dixon first achieved fame. He formed a non-denominational People's Church in downtown Manhattan, where he first caught the eye of John D. Rockefeller, who talked of building him a great tabernacle. In 1899, he turned to public lecturing and wrote his racist trilogy of novels. The first, The Leopard's Spots, subtitled A Romance of the White Man's Burden, 1865 to 1900, was written in 1902 and concluded that peace could only be achieved through separation of the races. Dixon submitted his manuscript of Leopard's Spots for publication to an old friend from North Carolina, Walter Hines Page, who had become the co-owner of the New York publishing firm of Doubleday, Page & Company. A virulent Confederate Anglophile who as a child had witnessed Sherman's army march past his North Carolina home, Page later became U.S. ambassador to Great Britain under President Woodrow Wilson and played a critical role in organizing American entry into World War I on the side of the British. Page eagerly published Dixon's book, which sold more than 100,000 copies in the first 3 months of its release. The publication of The Klansman in 1905 outsold Dixon's first 2 books and was produced as a play. In 1906, Dixon's other novel, The One Woman, was rewritten by him as a play, and he asked then little-known actor to perform the lead role, D.W. Griffith. David Wark Griffith was born on a small farm near Louisville in 1875. His father, Jacob Wark Griffith, at the outbreak of the Civil War, joined the Confederate Army and became a colonel. After the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox, the Confederate Secretary of State, Breckinridge, assigned Colonel Griffith the ill-fated task of attempting to secretly escort the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, to a safe house in Kentucky in hopes of continuing the existence of the Confederate government. During the filming of Birth of a Nation, Griffith would brag that his father had ridden with the Ku Klux Klan. As a young man, Griffith moved to Louisville, where he began to undertake an acting career and where he first joined the Masons. By 1913, Griffith was the head of production and a film director for Mutual Film Production, owned by Harry and Roy Aitken, and had already begun to shoot films during the winter months in Hollywood, California. In 1914, Griffith and an associate, film critic Frank Woods, obtained the copyright for the motion picture production of Dixon's book, The Klansman. Griffith tells the story in his autobiography. Quote, "One fortunate day, Woods brought a book to me. It was The Klansman by Dixon. I skipped quickly through the book until I got to the part about the Klansman, who, according to no less than Woodrow Wilson, ran to the rescue of the downtrodden South after the Civil War. I could just see these Klansmen in a movie with their white robes flying." Unquote. In addition to hiring the Reverend Dixon to help draft the script, Griffith drew heavily on Woodrow Wilson's A History of the American People for the written dialogue of the movie. Shooting of The Klansman started in 1914 on Griffith's studio lot in Sunset Boulevard, Hollywood. The music was written for a 40-piece orchestra with an offstage chorus and sound effects. In addition to the use of popular Civil War songs, the musical accompaniment drew heavily from various classical composers, and most importantly from Richard Wagner. Wagner, a worse anti-Semite than Adolf Hitler and an Anglo-Saxon race patriot in his own right, was appropriately used in providing the music of his Ride of the Valkyries for the Klan Ride. The official premiere of Griffith's Klansman took place on February 8, 1915 in Los Angeles. The opening, however, was not greeted with open arms by all. The small local chapter of the Los Angeles NAACP had gone into court in an attempt to obtain an injunction against the film. The legal argument employed, which was to be used subsequently by other NAACPs around the nation, was on the grounds that exhibiting the film would be a threat to public safety by heightening racial tensions and would incite violence and possible rioting. The NAACP was not successful. Less than 2 weeks after its LA premiere, The Klansman was to open in New York City. After a private showing to a select group in New York, including Dixon, it was decided to rename the film Birth of a Nation. However, simply changing the name in Griffith's cinematic bottle of poison was not deemed adequate by the film's creators to stave off the expected adverse public reaction to such an explicit display of Confederate treason. Therefore, it was decided that before the film's public opening, it would be wise to garner endorsements for the film by some of America's more respectable establishment figures. Thinking big, Mr. Griffith and his KKK roadshow headed south for Washington. Dixon wrote a letter to his old friend from Johns Hopkins University, now President Woodrow Wilson, requesting a half-hour interview, which the president granted. As a result, on February 18, 1915, The Klansman became the first motion picture ever to be shown in the White House. Wilson's comment after viewing the film was, quote, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true," unquote. This quote was quickly put into general circulation to promote the picture. Then it was on to the U.S. Supreme Court, where Reverend Dixon, during a private meeting, discovered that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Edward White, had been a member of the old Ku Klux Klan. White and other Supreme Court justices, as well as select congressmen and others, attended again a private showing of Birth of a Nation. After its New York premiere on March 3, 1915, newspaper reviews of essentially all the major press sidestepped the racial controversy and only had praise for the film. The Hearst Evening Journal was typical. Quote, "First of all, children must be sent to this masterpiece. Any parent who neglects this advice is committing an educational offense, for no film has ever produced more educational points than Griffith's latest achievement," unquote. During its filming, someone had mentioned to Griffith that if the film was ever shown in Atlanta, the result would be a race riot, to which Griffith prophetically replied, "I hope to God they do," unquote. In most of the northern cities where Birth of a Nation was scheduled to be shown, political fights exploded, and some small race riots did occur in Philadelphia, Boston, and elsewhere. The NAACP and others, attempting to seek either a banning of the film completely or to force the editing out of its most egregious racist scenes. For the most part, those attempts failed. Endless hearings were held before mayors, state legislatures, and others around the country. The hearings became public platforms for the pro-Griffith lobby to pronounce the alleged virtues of eugenics and racial purification. Griffith's lawyer, Martin Littleton, told New York City Mayor Mitchell that the film was, quote, "a protest against the mongrel mixture of black and white," unquote. Griffith would insist until his dying day that Birth of a Nation was the gospel truth. In self-righteous indignation, Griffith authored a mass pamphlet entitled The Rise and Fall of Free Speech, which argued against any attempts to censor his film. His letters and articles were printed in papers across the country. In one case, he prophetically envisioned the future use of film and the creation of today's video culture. He stated that, quote, "the next generation will be wedded to the movies. You will not be able to satisfy them with anything else," unquote. He envisioned the elimination of libraries and historical researchers to be replaced by a priesthood of cinema experts, such as himself. His next cinema project, Intolerance, was his answer to his critics. The film is truly Masonic in theme and content. The focus of the film's substance and production cost were devoted to depicting ancient Babylon, which Griffith titles, quote, "the first known court of justice in the world." This is the actual film set. Birth of a Nation, however, was a monumental box office smash, unlike Intolerance, which flopped. And as one of the actresses, Lillian Gish, later stated in an interview, quote, "they lost track of the money it was making. But it started all," this is a quote, "but it started all of the fortunes of Louis B. Mayer, all the people in films." At a time when the average entrance fee to a movie theater was 15 cents, the cost of Birth of a Nation was $2. In some cities, it ran continuously for almost a year. At one point, there were 28 companies touring the film throughout the world. Estimates of the total box office take vary anywhere from $50 to $100 million, though production costs were less than $100,000. It became apparent to all that there were big profits to be made in motion pictures. So the floodgates opened and money poured into Hollywood. Felix Kahn, one of the earliest investors in Birth of a Nation, sold his large New York theater to Paramount and became a member of its board of directors. Through Felix Kahn, Paramount owner Adolf Zukor met his brother Otto Kahn, a partner in the Warburg financial firm of Kuhn Loeb. By 1919, Zukor had arranged a $10 million loan from Kuhn Loeb and had launched the Paramount film empire. Warner Brothers became a major studio with the 1925 investment of Goldman Sachs. The man who became the movie mogul of Columbia Pictures, Harry Cohn, was a notorious and ardent supporter of Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. Cohn made a documentary of Il Duce, and after visiting him in Rome, returned to Hollywood where he decorated his office to match that of the Italian dictators. He kept a photograph of Mussolini on his desk even through World War II. Harry Cohn was not the only member of the Mussolini Hollywood fan club. In 1924, on his return from Italy, Griffith told the New York press, quote, "Mussolini is a great man. With the allegiance of youth behind him, he could do great things. Who knows but that he may be a Napoleon who'll sweep the world. I believe that anything may happen as a result of this fascism. I should like to put into a film the remarkable spirit of the fascisti," unquote. Not long after the re-election of Woodrow Wilson in 1916, Griffith was summoned by Wilson to the White House and asked to go to Europe to produce a propaganda film supporting the British and French cause against the Germans. A meeting was arranged for Griffith with then Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain, at which the Prime Minister informed Griffith that, quote, he had the greatest power in his hands for the control of men's minds that the world had ever seen, unquote, and that he should undertake Winston Churchill's idea for a film scenario promoting the war effort. Quote, I want you to go to work for France and England and make up Americans' mind to go to war with us. Griffith readily accepted, and with the financial backing of the French and British, proceeded to produce a film called Hearts of the World, a propaganda film. On April 16th, the United States joined the British Empire and declared war on Germany. The film's portrayal of the German Huns as beasts, not unlike his portrayal of blacks in Birth of a Nation, would have an effect in shaping the post-war climate of the Versailles Treaty. The high point of Griffith's tour in Britain was a formal audience at Buckingham Palace with the Queen and Queen Mother. In his autobiography, he said, quote, now I was going to meet the queens. Filled with dreams, I was determined to make an impression on these ladies, one they would never forget. In fact, I was mentally already in the bosom of the royal family. Not long after his return to Hollywood, Griffith established United Artists in 1919 with Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, and Mary Pickford. The film studio, which was to dominate Hollywood, began as a result of Birth of a Nation. In 1915, Louis Mayer ran a distributorship for a small string of theaters in Massachusetts. As Birth of a Nation was about to start, he arranged a deal to distribute the film for a roughly 50-50 split of the box office receipts. In that single deal, Mayer made well over $500,000. And with that money, Mayer went on to ultimately found the mother of all Hollywood studios, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. In 1939, shortly after Hitler and Stalin had occupied Poland, MGM Associates released its full-length color epic based on the Confederate tradition of Griffith's Birth of a Nation. The film, which premiered in Atlanta, Georgia, was Gone with the Wind, often called the greatest movie ever made. The film was based on the racist book authored by Margaret Mitchell, who wrote to her mentor, Reverend Thomas Dixon, after her success, to tell him that his writings had been her inspiration since childhood. The movie was produced by Louis Mayer's son-in-law, David Selznick, and financed by Jock Whitney of the New York Herald Tribune, a scion of the Harriman family. Ben Hecht, the man who wrote the script for the film, later became the chief propagandist and fundraiser in the United States for the terrorist Irgun. And during World War II, Hecht organized the first Irgun fundraiser for Hollywood's elites in the commissary of 20th Century Fox. The man on the right is Louis B. Mayer, and next to him is Dory Sherry. As if Hollywood films weren't bad enough already, Sherry was the man who created the idea of the B-grade movie. He then became vice president in charge of production for MGM. Dory was a lifelong friend of one of Meyer Lansky's top aides, Abner Longies Willman, and in 1963, after Sherry quit Hollywood, he became the national director of the Anti-Defamation League. Beginning in the early 20s, dozens of Hollywood executives, directors, and actors joined the Los Angeles B'nai B'rith, including Harry and Jack Warner, Louis Meyer, Irving Thalberg, and William Fox. Many of them, like the Warner brothers, also joined the Masons. I won't elaborate on the organized crime connections here of Hollywood, which would be a much longer speech. When D.W. Griffith died in June 23rd, 1948, his Hollywood service was not held in a church, but at the Hollywood Masonic Temple. His pallbearers included Louis Meyer and Sam Goldwyn. Afterwards, he was buried in his hometown in Kentucky. Now we want to see a few clips of the film Birth of a Nation, which will give you a pretty good sense of what the film is about. If there's... All right. Lights? This is from the legislature. They're showing black rule. South Carolina is the image of it, was the model. Of course, in this, you can't hear the music in the background. This is the colonel, the little colonel who is going to found the Ku Klux Klan. And this is where he gets his inspiration. These two little white children, they put a sheet over their head. And they scare the little children away. This is a lynching. For rape of a white woman, of course. Quick trial. governor, of course, is black, so they're throwing the corpse on his doorstep. This is the black soldiers about to break in. The men are about to kill the women if necessary. This is the famous Klan ride from the movie. The music for this is the Ride of the Valkyries, which you can't hear. They're coming in to save the day. And that's basically it. In conclusion, let me just say that if we're going to eliminate the cultural scourge, oh, it's not finished. This is the triumphal final scene here. They've charged into a town, they've saved all of the white women, who were all on the verge of being raped. And if we're going to eliminate the cultural scourge of Hollywood with all its sordid collection of pimps, whores, and criminals, it will not be done by simply boycotting your local video store or television set. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the founding of two of the most treasonous institutions in the United States, the Federal Reserve Bank and the Anti-Defamation League. Let us work to ensure that 1993 witnessed the demise of these twin evils. If we do that, the fall of Hollywood will not be far behind, and we can return the handiwork of D.W. Griffith back to the ground of its old Kentucky home.
Particularly interested to see that trial scene. Now we know where the rocket docket came from also. Virginia Justice, and so on and so forth. Incidentally, we will have messages of greetings read to the conference shortly, a bit later this morning, from Michael Billington and from Shelley Asher. But right now I would like to proceed, if the video film is ready, with the next presentation, which is by Michael Minicino. Mike has been the author of numerous studies on the subject of the Tavistock going back to 1974, studies on the Frankfurt School, and they've been printed in the New Federalist and upcoming publications as well. An article on political correctness recently printed in Fidelio magazine, and so on. The subject of Mike's presentation today is the Frankfurt School and its demonic influence on modern culture, which you already know a little bit about.
Most of what you see and hear around you, not only when you turn on your TV set or your radio, but when you simply walk down the street, most of this is based upon theories that are designed to drive you stark raving mad. Today, American culture is dominated by a group of theories which can be usefully lumped together under the term postmodernism. These include all manner of so-called political correctness, multiculturalism, Afrocentrism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, different, often hostile ideologies. But they all share a core philosophy. Stripped of the jargon, postmodernism is really very old stuff and can be traced to the racist ideology of Aristotle. But the proximate origins of the philosophy that we're dealing with today can be traced to three sources: the proto-Nazi 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, the card-carrying Nazi 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger, and the nominally communist philosophers of the so-called Frankfurt School. And no postmodernist of today would disagree, no matter what stripe they are, with this characterization of their ideology. The purpose of all postmodernist theory is to create what Georg Lukács, the founder of the Frankfurt School, called the culture of pessimism. That culture, art, music, literature, and the banal, popularized versions of that we call entertainment, could be turned into a weapon of social control if, and only if, the optimism which is inherent in Western Judeo-Christian civilization could be subverted. Back in 1922, Lukács was commissioned by the Communist International to figure out why Bolshevism had not succeeded beyond the borders of Russia. He and the group of Marxist theorists, which he gathered together in Frankfurt, Germany, determined that the problem was, to make a very long story short, that the West still had the concept of a soul. That is, despite the pessimism that was widespread amongst cultural elites, especially after the collapse of the United States as a moral superpower after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Despite this pessimism, there was a countervailing tendency, an optimistic tendency within Western civilization. The West still taught that the individual had a soul, a divine spark of reason, that through the exercise of reason, the individual could discern with ever greater clarity God's plan of creation, which meant that no matter how bad things got, there was always the hope that mankind could solve its problems. Now, the Frankfurt School determined that this optimism could not stand if there were to be revolution in the West. As Lukács, the founder of the Frankfurt School, wrote at the time, people must become convinced that they live in a world that has been abandoned by God, and that their only hope is revolution. And now in this, Lukács was echoing very consciously the sentiments of his acknowledged forebear, Friedrich Nietzsche, who had written, and I quote, "We must give the coup de grace to that other and even more fatal atomism that Christianity has been teaching, the atomism of the soul. Let us be permitted to use that term to denote the belief that regards the soul as something ineradicable, eternal, indivisible, as a monad. That belief must be thrown out of science," unquote. Now, Nietzsche's specification of Leibniz's concept of the monad is crucial here. For all postmodernist theory, from Nietzsche on, depends absolutely on the denial of the individual sovereign power of creative reason, as discussed by Leibniz. Now, the Frankfurt School and its collaborators determined that the easiest angle of attack was on the highest expressions of Judeo-Christian culture itself. New theories had to be created to radically redefine art in such a way as to prove that science in art was not possible. That the basic technologies that had been developed so that art might embody the soaring aspirations of mankind were merely outdated bourgeois niceties. For instance, the very basic stuff, that the concept of the narrative, that art has a story to tell, was obsolete. That figuration and perspective, the breakthrough by which an artist can bring us into the space of a painting, was obsolete. That tonality and the lawful development in music or poetry was obsolete. These theories were developed, and they are the operant theories of art today. These theories are the single reason why most of you in this audience can look at an example of modern art, modern music, modern poetry, and say, that's silly, that's stupid. But all of the critics and most of the professors can respond, you poor, unsophisticated person. Don't you realize this is great art? And it's worth a lot more money than you'll ever see. Let me give you a little taste of how this operates. If we could have the lights down a bit and the slides. Are we ready? Okay. Vincent van Gogh. Obvious title, Three Pairs of Shoes. 1887. Now, a lot of people like Van Gogh. I'm sorry I could only had time to get a black and white slide. Doesn't hurt the argument. I show this slide because Martin Heidegger, the Nazi founder of existentialism, wrote a very influential essay on this particular picture. Heidegger says that what makes this painting a breakthrough is that it is not just a still life, still lives not having people in them, but the choice of shoes without people as opposed to fruit or flowers. As the subject of the painting is actually a polemic, because it forces the viewer to recognize that the shoes have been detached from the people who wear them. So that the painting is a conscious statement of dehumanization. And because the painting is forcibly dehumanized, says Martin Heidegger, you have a better concept of the painting as an object of art, and the viewer, you, can understand more clearly your position as a member of dehumanized society. And Heidegger adds that this polemic is aided by the conscious degeneration of perspective here. Okay. It works. 20 years later, the narrative, which is still more or less there in the Van Gogh, is now almost gone. Perspective has more or less disappeared. The painting does not exist in your space. In fact, it doesn't even exist in your time. The figure in the bottom right corner is painted consciously in two different time frames. We have, with Picasso and his collaborators, the conscious primitivization of art, a reversal, a conscious reversal of centuries of development. 20 years later, you don't need to bother with the obsolete concepts of narrative, figuration, or perspective. Grade school geometry and color juxtaposition will suffice. 20 years later, you don't need more than one color. 20 years later, and the polemic takes its mature form. I see all the Ballantine fans out there. What's happening here? There is no art. There is no art. There are just things. There are just feeling states and individual values. Art is whatever I say is art. Now, the same thing is true in architecture. Here is the recently completed international headquarters of ATT in Manhattan by Philip Johnson, who is the most influential architect in America today and a leading postmodern. Those of you who are familiar with antique furniture will notice that the building is topped with what looks suspiciously like a Chippendale furniture ornament. And that is what it is. The architect claims that by putting a 50-story antique set of drawers in the middle of New York, he has forced the viewer to rethink his or her concepts of the purpose of architecture. Now, just compare in your minds for a second. I don't have the slides. Compare in your minds the moral purpose of the architects of the Parthenon or the Chartres Cathedral with the moral purpose of the architect of this nonsense. Now, there's also an extremist wing of postmodern architecture, which is called literally deconstructionist architecture. And you'll hear more about deconstructionism specifically later on in this conference. This is real. This is the Best Product showroom in Towson, Maryland. It's about an hour from here. You can see that a terrible natural disaster has torn the facade off. Unfortunately, in this case, the natural disaster was the deconstructionist architect. And here's my personal favorite. This is a multi-million-dollar new research center at the University of Stuttgart in Germany. False facades, exposed pipes that lead nowhere, and a window hung by a chimpanzee. No offense to chimpanzees. Now, what I have shown you is ugly. It was meant to be ugly. All of this is supposed to be great art, according to the Frankfurt School and the other postmodernists, because it forces you to accept the truth that life is ugly under capitalism, and that you have no soul, and that your life leads nowhere, except whatever bodily titillation that you might obtain along the way. Now, I could, if we had the time, do a comparable demonstration for today's literature, poetry, dance, music. All of it ugly. All of it based explicitly on these theories. All of it designed to reverse, consciously, thousands of years of human mental development. And that's why postmodernism has been so heavily sponsored over the last 25 to 30 years. Postmodernist artistic theory is the cultural expression of post-industrial economic theory. It says that the only form of progress possible is the advance of the individual's hedonism. Now, unfortunately, the work of the Frankfurt School was not limited to the theoretical, as you can partially say. When Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, the Frankfurt School was relocated to the United States through the good offices of the Rockefeller Foundation, the American Jewish Committee, and Columbia University. One of the most important operations of the school in America was something called the Radio Project, set up with funds from CBS Network and the federal government at Princeton University in 1936. The dominant force in the Radio Project was the Frankfurt School's Theodor Adorno, who had realized that there had to be new forms of culture created to complete the dehumanization and alienation of society. Especially important, said Adorno, was leisure activity, for that was the period when people sat down to think. They threatened to think, potentially dangerous to the Frankfurt School's plans. Adorno identified that the introduction of the motion picture, radio, and television, and Adorno was one of the very first people to talk about the theoretical implications of television back in the 1940s, that these things had begun to change the way people approached art. Adorno realized that the electronic mass media were a kind of universal solvent. They reduced everything to entertainment. For instance, you put a masterpiece of classical music on the radio, and most people actually don't hear the piece as an intellectual whole. They split it up into the easy or familiar parts that entertain them, and into the difficult parts, which they forget instantaneously. People, said Adorno, become more primitive in their listening and approach art just like sports. And he said, and I quote, "They are not childlike, the listeners, you and me, but they are childish. Their primitivism is not that of the undeveloped, but that of the forcibly retarded," unquote. Now, the radio project actually developed instrumentalities based upon this analysis. The most important of these is something called the Stanton-Lazarsfeld Program Analyzer, officially. It's known in the business as Little Annie. A device for testing programming. The test audience is hooked up to a rheostat which can register the degrees of like and dislike over the course of a show. So the purpose is not to determine what people thought of the show as a whole, because that requires higher mental functioning in which the radio project was uninterested, but to gauge the moment-to-moment feeling states of the audience. Then the dissociated moments could be reproduced, and this device is now used, has been, and is today universally used to test all new television, all new film, all new radio and commercial programming. That's why there's nothing new on television. Certain plot situations, certain pairing of actors, certain musical accompaniment that rate highly on these devices are transposed, combined, recombined, recombined endlessly, and people watch it because they're looking actually at something very familiar, like an old sweater. And in the 1980s, Little Annie, this device, was universally started to be used in political campaigns. And the man who owns the largest program analyzer in this country used in politics is Robert Teeter, who was George Bush's 1992 campaign manager. You see, TV is the triumph of postmodernist theory, as Adorno predicted it would be. Everything becomes superficial. That's from Don Hewitt, who was the founder of 60 Minutes. Everything becomes desensitized, dehumanized. Television news is not information, it is entertainment. The network anchors are not journalists, they're entertainers. ABC's Peter Jennings was created by careful profiles by Roone Ardledge, the head of ABC Sports. People who think they are informed love to watch the political talk shows. They don't understand it's carefully crafted entertainment. It's called value conflict in the business. You have a stock conservative character, you have a stock liberal character, you have a mediator who's neutral, they throw zingers at each other, you root for your team, and it's all designed that way as entertainment. Over the last few years, TV has begun to fulfill the role set for it by Adorno, especially with the introduction of the immensely popular rock videos, which shrink the attention span down to 2 minutes of irrationalism and pornography. This is a statement by the man who created Mort Downey that went on to found MTV, and he is now a media advisor to Albert Gore. We are now fulfilling the horrible circle that has been set up for us by the Frankfurt School. Now, incidentally, the radio project also was responsible for the development of modern public opinion polling, which since 1972 has been in partnership with TV, the dominant force in American elections. And the pollsters go to great lengths, like this statement of George Gallup in the 1940s, to say how scientific and important they are. Of course, George Gallup's assistant had a slightly different point of view. Polls are a wonderful example of cognitive dissonance. Everybody says they don't trust them and everybody believes them. They're garbage, even if the results say what you want them to say. The whole concept is absurd if you think about it, because it depends on your denial of your own soul, your own sovereign soul. A monad is a majority by definition. In questions of morality and science, the truth carries the majority. even if only one person knows the truth. In addition, technically polls don't exist, and if people want to find out how that works in the question period, we can. Where does this all lead? Could we quickly get to the videotape? Because they're about to put the hook on me. Forget it. I'll just describe it. What it is merely an... Are you all being entertained? This is not, it's not this self-reflexive. This is very postmodernist to be just constantly self-reflexive like this. Yeah, exactly. Now people know I'm real because they've seen me on television. There it is.
Continuing our discussion now with Lyndon LaRouche. Mr. LaRouche, we're almost out of time, but as you know, as a credible presidential candidate, you're going to have to learn to talk in television sound bites. So give me your vision.
That's it. That's all I wanted to show. Postmodernism's ultimate goal, is to make you incapable of participation in the political process. Can I have that one last slide? To make you believe, as the Frankfurt School's Walter Benjamin said, and you'll get that slide in just a second, and he said this 50 years ago, that politics have no moral end. It's just another form of entertainment where you root for your team against the other team and vote the way the polls tell you to vote. Ted Koppel's comment to Lynn says it all. Most people have been trained to be hostile to complicated answers and to accept the kind of calculated superficialities that ratify their own prejudices. The American people have been, in Adorno's phrase, forcibly retarded. Now, I want all of you in the audience to think of yourselves as educators. Education, in the very first instance, aims at increasing the child's attention span so that the real work of education can begin. That is what we must do. This nation will not survive without a population that is capable of understanding complicated answers, like those given by Lyndon LaRouche and written weekly in New Federalist. We must help our fellow citizens look past the ugliness that is making them stupid and let them see the beauty which is mankind's birthright. Thank you.
The next presentation is by Jeffrey Steinberg. Jeff is the counterintelligence editor of the Executive Intelligence Review. He is co-editor of at least two books which he admits to having co-authored. One is Dope Incorporated, the other is The Ugly Truth About the ADL. And he will speak today on the subject of money laundering and sports. Jeff?
To repeat a central point that Mike Minicino just presented, through the medium of popular culture, especially the Hollywood entertainment industry, a communist international scheme, so to speak, hatched just a few years after the Bolshevik Revolution by people like Lukács, Adorno, Max Horkheimer, is on the verge of destroying the United States and much of Western civilization, of destroying our essential goodness, embodied in the Western Judeo-Christian notion of the sanctity of the individual soul. Ironically, This is taking place at the exact same time that the Berlin Wall has been torn down and the Soviet Union has collapsed. Communism may be dead and discredited for many people on the streets of Moscow, but in Hollywood, communism, in its Frankfurt School form, is not only alive and well, it's booming. It has become, in the closing decades of the 20th century, America's last remaining growth industry. The mass marketing of cultural pessimism and forced retardation has replaced scientific progress, technologically intensive manufacturing, and modern agriculture as the heart and soul of the American economy. Cultural subversion today is a multi-trillion-dollar enterprise, and the executors of the Frankfurt School's cultural warfare are among America's wealthiest entrepreneurs. Just consider the following. Last year, the worldwide sale and distribution of radio, television, and film products generated $150 billion in revenue. About $40 billion of that reflected domestic sales here in the United States alone. Add on to that U.S. figure nearly $50 billion in sales of audio and visual equipment, $10 billion in sporting goods sales, $30 billion in toy sales, probably an increasing amount of that being adult toys of all sorts of unimaginable forms, $500 billion in legal casino gambling, and $50 billion spent on alcohol. That totals $680 billion spent on ostensibly legal, mind-deadening entertainment in the United States in 1992. And one can immediately add on another $40 billion passed directly into the hands of the ADL's friends in organized crime through illegal gambling in the United States last year. And of course, we have not yet even mentioned the $800 billion in sales last year of illegal drugs. About half of those sales occurred right here in the United States. 32 years ago, speaking at a conference sponsored by the United States State Department's U.S. Information Agency at the California Medical School in San Francisco, Aldous Huxley spelled out his future vision for America. And when I read this quote from Huxley, people should think back to the Pike-Mazzini dialogues and correspondence that Tony Chaikin talked about earlier. Huxley said at the U.S. government conference, quote, "There will be in the next generation or so a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak. Producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution. What we have today with our multi-trillion-dollar a year combined legal and underground entertainment industry in this country borders so close on Huxley's final revolution that it will take an extraordinary effort to turn back this New Age onslaught. We are at the center of that effort, and I, for one, am optimistic that we can succeed. The task, nevertheless, is formidable. Here in America, in Western Europe, and increasingly in Eastern Europe and the territories of the former Soviet Union, this mass marketing of literally Sodom and Gomorrah is spreading like wildfire. The radio, TV, and film industry last year reported a growth rate of 15%. What auto, steel, or petrochemical firm could report such figures for fiscal year 1992? The gross profits from the sale of illegal drugs are doubling every 5 years. These dollar figures that I've been tossing around may seem a bit abstract, so let's do some comparison shopping and see what these sums of money are capable of purchasing. Let's just look at the defense budget, which is something that many politicians are very fond of hammering away at. Way back in 1978, when Lyndon LaRouche first commissioned the writing of the book Dope Incorporated, we determined that the gross sales of illegal drugs for that year alone were somewhere in the vicinity of between $250 and $300 billion, a relative pittance by today's standards. By comparison, however, the entire cost of the U.S. war in Vietnam was less than $230 billion. Americans spent more money buying illegal narcotics in 1 year, every year during the 1980s, than the entire cost of the Vietnam War. The cumulative gross profits of the illegal drug sales from 1978, when we first wrote Dope Incorporated, up until 1990, conservatively add up to $6.25 trillion. That is more than the entire cost to the U.S. government and the U.S. people of the Cold War from 1945 until the fall of the Berlin Wall. This includes the Korean War, the missile race, Vietnam, all of the CIA and Pentagon covert wars, the entire defense and intelligence budget of the post-World War II epoch. But in a certain sense, even these figures are a bit deceptive. They grossly understate the devastating impact of drugs and money laundering on the economy. In the wave of cultural pessimism that swept across America following the assassinations of the 1960s, John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, the policymaking establishment in the United States adopted the insane dogma of what was called the post-industrial society. That's quite a politically correct term. It's like calling death post-life. The effect on the American economy of the adoption of the post-industrial society program was more or less the equivalent of death. In a sequence of stunning reforms beginning under Lyndon Johnson, the U.S. financial system was put through the free market post-industrial ringer. Richard Nixon, who, by the way, passed the most generous investment tax credits on to the entertainment industry, in his infamous August 15, 1971 New Economic Policy, decoupled the dollar from the gold-based system of fixed exchange rates. Nixon, in effect, inaugurated what is today a $1 trillion a day unregulated currency speculation market. Through Kissinger's oil hoax of 1973 to 74, energy costs were artificially inflated. The oil multinationals and their allied banks made a killing in what came to be known as petrodollars and eurodollars, and our farming and manufacturing base took its first really big hit. Next came the deregulation frenzy, beginning in 1978 under the Carter Trilateral Commission administration. Banking deregulation is a Washington Wall Street euphemism for the legalization of drug money laundering, plain and simple. Between 1978 and 1982, all existing regulations that protected banks against invasion by offshore illegal capital were abolished. Dope trafficking may have remained technically illegal in this country, but the flow of dope dollars into the main arteries of the American banking system were totally legalized. Prior to this banking deregulation, money laundering was a fairly labor-intensive business. Organized crime had taken a big chunk of its Prohibition-era profits and built up the Nevada gambling industry, the motion picture industry, professional sports, and other high-volume cash businesses to facilitate laundering their dirty money. With the dope offensive of the 1970s, however, this mode of money washing no longer sufficed. Since organized crime, the Lansky Syndicate, the ADL, were always just assets of the international financial oligarchy and their southern jurisdiction Scottish Rite infrastructure, it was no problem to call on other assets, in the Congress in particular, to turn the world banking system into one big laundromat for dirty cash. The FBI and the Federal Reserve, which along with the ADL were treasonous turn-of-the-century creations of the Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson crowd, provided critical aid in this narco-dollar offensive. The FBI, through its 1979 abscam frame-up of Senator Harrison Williams, broke the congressional opposition to bank deregulation. Senator Williams was pushing legislation to reestablish international banking ground rules to protect American banks and you, the depositors. Courtesy of gay Edgar Hoover's FBI, Senator Williams was carted off to federal prison, and the U.S. Congress rolled over and played dead. For the most part, they're still playing dead today. The abscam message from the FBI to the Congress was very simple. Take your money and your marching orders from the ADL, from organized crime, and from the Southern jurisdiction, and we'll leave you alone. Take on the banks, and you're as good as dead. The Fed, particularly after Paul Volcker's appointment as chairman in 1979, delivered the second devastating blow to the U.S. banking system by progressively jacking up interest rates to over 20%. What honest businessman could borrow money at 20% to invest in manufacturing expansion, job creation, plant modernization? What farmer, even a farmer who owned his own land outright, could buy seed and fertilizer, replace equipment, or irrigate his or her land at 20% interest rates? What average Joe could take out a home mortgage at those exorbitant, usurious rates? On the other hand, the combined effect of eliminating of the bank transparency laws and the Fed's high interest rate policy turned our banks and saving institutions into safe and lucrative havens for offshore drug money. It's no wonder that when President Reagan briefly toyed with the idea back in the spring of 1981 of dumping Volcker as chairman of the Fed, in large measure at the urging of Lyndon LaRouche and the growing political movement at that time that stood behind the demand to eliminate the power of the Fed, David Rockefeller personally visited the White House and threatened to unleash, quote, a financial firestorm over Washington, unquote, if the president did not back down. By 1982, the U.S. banking system was more addicted to dope dollars than the worst junkie on the street was addicted to heroin or cocaine. The banking system had dried up as a source of credit for honest investors out to create productive jobs in manufacturing or farming. Narco dollars flooded into the U.S. and brought new ruin to what was left of the American economy. Junk bonds became the new preferred mode of financing for the real estate bubble and corporate asset stripping. Junk bonds as in junk that was being peddled on the streets of America to generate the cash for these things. Most of you are familiar with the dramatis personae. Ivan Boesky, Michael Milken, both generous multi-million-dollar tax-exempt contributors to the ADL. The ADL's own national chairman and top Wall Street lawyer, Kenneth Bialkin, the man who put Robert Vesco and the Medellin cartel in the dope business. All are members of Meyer Lansky's national crime syndicate. In the case of Milken and Boesky, they briefly went to jail for their ostensible crime, insider trading. But these fellows were never prosecuted for their real crime, dope money laundering. Michael Milken, who operated out of the Beverly Hills, i.e. Hollywood, branch office of Drexel Burnham Lambert, could access tens of billions of dollars on a moment's notice. By 1984, when Milken was orchestrating Carl Icahn's planned takeover of Phillips Petroleum, he could write what he called, quote, a highly confident letter, simply asserting that he could deliver $4 billion in cash for the corporate takeover and looting. No cash on the barrel, no role whatsoever for any commercial bank, just the word of Michael Milken. Where was the money? The closest thing to an answer that Milken ever gave was offshore. Now, who in their right mind would have even a second thought about what Milken was referring to when he proclaimed his ability to access tens of billions of dollars parked somewhere offshore? the entire economy of virtually every country in the Caribbean couldn't generate $10 billion in liquidity in 20 years' time. And he was talking about accessing tens of billions of dollars offshore. On the strength of those two words, highly confident, and on the narco dollars standing behind them, Milken's raiders cut a path through corporate America that left in its wake plant closings, layoffs, a string of Chapter 11 bankruptcies, the S&L debacle, the blowout of the commercial real estate market, and now the pending unavoidable blowout of the commercial bank sector. It is impossible to comprehend what happened to the physical economy, our financial system, or our culture over the past 25 years without understanding the full meaning of this narco-dollar phenomenon. In the 1980s, this was heralded as the consumer-led recovery. Increase in consumption, however, is not in every instance a good thing. Just ask the snake who's biting his own tail what happens if he increases his consumption too rapidly. That's more or less what happened to the U.S. economy over the last 25 years. Since the assassination of President Kennedy and the introduction on a mass scale of this irrationalist, culturally pessimistic garbage. Fortunately, there is someone on the scene who has had an awful lot of experience fighting against these monsters and has a field commander's sense of how to hit the enemy on his most vulnerable flank. I'm talking about Lyndon LaRouche. Recently, Mr. LaRouche issued a call for the U.S. government to impose a 0.1% tax on all derivative transactions. The derivative markets are all of the unregulated spawns of the bank deregulation and narco-dollar invasions we've been discussing here. It's speculative betting on future values of currencies, stock indexes, you name it. Your grandfather's shirt size 3 years from now. There are even derivative markets betting on future bankruptcy liquidation rates, and that's a real growth industry for you. LaRouche's proposal is very simple. Force speculators to declare all of these derivative transactions and collect this 0.1% tax on the nominal value of the items being bought or swapped. By forcing these transactions into the light of day under penalty of criminal prosecution for failure to report them, it becomes possible to trace the vast majority of the dirty money flows. By imposing this tax, revenues are generated that in no way interfere with legitimate and productive economic activity. It's a tax on the parasites playing with your future using dope dollars. How much are we talking about? On a daily basis, there are about $1 trillion in foreign currency transactions, the majority of which occur on these derivative markets. $300 billion a day in trading goes on in various kinds of bonds. The little tax that LaRouche is talking about could mean additional revenues of over $1 billion a day. You want to wipe out the official federal government deficit of $300 billion in 1 year or less without any new taxes targeted at honest citizens? Without any further damage to what remains of our legitimate economy? Then let's launch an all-out effort to get this derivative tax implemented, taking the kind of spirit and using the kinds of methods that Mr. LaRouche referred to yesterday in the efforts during the 1982-83 period. That one little act would start the ball rolling for the reestablishment of national banking and the revival of the American system of political economy. It will stop the hemorrhaging. It won't turn back the onslaught of Sodom and Gomorrah, but it will be an indispensable first step towards restoring our nation and the world as a whole to sanity. Even more importantly, it will be a victory for cultural optimism, one in what we must establish as a long string of such necessary victories. Tearing down the Pike statue is another one. Destroying the Southern jurisdiction in the ADL, another. Victories for cultural optimism. And that, more than anything else, is really what is required to save the world today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Although I have to say I have to take issue with one thing Jeff mentioned, which is the idea of a futures market in grandfather's shirt size 3 years from now. If these policies continue, grandfather will be dead. And that is the subject of our next presentation, which will be delivered by Kathleen Klinetsky, who is the U.S. editor of Executive Intelligence Review. Her topic is the postmodernist social agenda, societal euthanasia, Kevorkian style. Kathleen?
Ideas have consequences. And if good people don't fight evil ideas, if you think that you can make some kind of deal with the devil or give him a sphere of influence in which to operate, eventually you're going to have hell to pay. Those are the key lessons that I think need to be drawn from the presentations that we have just heard. It would be a drastic mistake to think that what the previous speakers have described exists only in the abstract or as interesting historical facts. Exactly the opposite is true. It is because the population of the United States has, by and large, tolerated the existence of Freemasonry, let itself be dominated by Hollywood and other forms of organized Satanism, and accepted the underlying zero-growth premises of the Malthusians, that we now find ourselves literally descending into hell. About 15 years ago, something calling itself the Aquarian Conspiracy crawled out of the closet. Helga alluded to this yesterday in her remarks. Essentially a second generation or more overtly New Age version of the Frankfurt School Project, the Aquarian Conspiracy represented an intensification of Freemasonry's war to destroy Western civilization. Based primarily at Stanford University's Research Institute, the Aquarian Conspiracy openly declared that its goal was to organize a massive paradigm shift from the age of Pisces, that is Christ, to the age of Dionysus. A crucial part of this paradigm shift was to force through a new image of man that would emphasize his irrational and hedonistic impulses while suppressing his capacity for creative reason, which is the unique characteristic that distinguishes man from animals and allows him to participate in the divine. Unfortunately, the Aquarian Conspiracy has pretty much accomplished its objectives, and what we are living with today are the awful consequences of this paradigm shift. The most fundamental idea of Western civilization, that man is made in the image of God, and that as a result, human life is sacred, has been severely eroded and now stands in danger of disappearing altogether. As a direct result of this, the floodgates are being opened in every area of life to the most extreme forms of barbarism. The mass genocide and mass systematic rapes taking place in Bosnia right now is a horrifying example of the evil that is inevitably unleashed when society discards the concept of the sacredness of life. We are verging on a satanic society. This is not an exaggeration. If you consider that the essence of evil is death and destruction, that the defining characteristic of Satanism is human sacrifice, then you have only to look at what has become of American society over the last 2 decades to realize just how close we have come to becoming an outright satanic entity. Look at the situation in the U.S. right now. Look at their schools. We now have a situation where children as young as the 1st grade are being taught in the classroom that homosexuality and other perversions are a legitimate alternative lifestyle. And although parents and church groups in New York City were recently able to oust the school's chancellor there, Joseph Fernandez, who was a champion of this atrocity called the Rainbow Curriculum, which was a so-called multicultural program that features such books as Heather Has 2 Mommies, similar courses are being promoted in schools throughout the country. Through so-called values education, such as the ADL's World of Difference program, children are being brainwashed into believing that the world has too few resources and too many people, and that the only solution to this dilemma is to knock off some of this excess human population. At Stanford University, which was the birthplace of the Aquarian Conspiracy, the long-standing Western civilization course requirement was eliminated several years ago on the grounds that Shakespeare, Leibniz, and the other dead white European males who contributed so much to the development of Western culture were too imperialistic or patriarchal. Now, under the banner of political correctness, students at Stanford participate in the Cultures, Ideas, and Values program, which features such courses as Population Perspectives in the Third World and Critical Perspectives on Feminist Theory. This evil cult of political correctness is rampaging through colleges and universities throughout the country, destroying anyone who has the temerity to stand up and defend Western values. This is ritual child abuse, plain and simple. We are allowing our children to be turned into illiterate, irrational beasts, incapable of coherent thought, and certainly incapable of running a country. This is how you soften up people for Satanism. We find an even more graphic demonstration of this demonic paradigm shift in the inroads which the so-called Right to Die movement has made over the past decade. Again, because the American population has compromised with the death lobby, going along with living wills, pulling the plug on coma patients, allowing abortion on demand, that we have wound up with a phenomenon like that Dr. Jack Kevorkian, a psychotic mass murderer who is running around the country killing people in cold blood. Not only is he getting away with this, but Kevorkian is being held up as a hero by some quarters. Now, evidence has now come to light that one of Kevorkian's most recent victims, Mr. Hugh Gantz, changed his mind at the last minute and told Dr. Death that he didn't want to die. Kevorkian went right ahead and pumped the poor man full of carbon monoxide until he was dead. Now that is the essence of the Death with Dignity movement, getting murdered in your sickbed by a doctor who has supposedly taken a sacred oath to heal you. Kevorkian's murder spree underscores what a hoax the whole Right to Die movement is. It's nothing but a movement designed to cut costs by killing off what the Nazi euthanasia program, on which it is explicitly modeled, called useless eaters. What Kevorkian victims and the victims of the Death with Dignity movement as a whole are discovering, unfortunately too late, is that you have a right to die in this country, but you no longer have a right to live. The U.S. is moving rapidly toward adopting a policy of active euthanasia. We are moving dangerously close to the situation that already exists in Holland, where under a state-imposed assisted suicide program, thousands of people are put to death each year like dogs without their consent because they are considered to be too great a burden on society. And in a very ominous development just a few days ago, President Clinton announced that he was giving the green light to a plan developed by the state of Oregon to implement health care rationing for Medicaid recipients. The plan, which even the Bush administration had blocked because of widespread protest by advocates for the disabled and the poor, is a Nazi policy, plain and simple. As Linda Everett has documented in New Federalist, the Oregon plan is primarily a triage program, not a health care program. It is designed to control medical costs by prohibiting treatment for certain categories of patients and illnesses. Under the plan, if you fall in one of the useless eaters categories, for instance, if you suffer from certain chronic disabilities, have been classified as terminally ill, even though this is a very unscientific and elastic definition, or are otherwise deemed to lack sufficient quality of life, you will be denied access to certain medical procedures, even though you may die without them. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, there are signs that the Clinton administration may actually use Oregon's Nazi plan as a model for its national health reform program, which would be a disastrous turn of events. We must understand that unless we force Clinton to adopt Lyndon LaRouche's economic policies, that the spiraling economic collapse will lead inexorably to the adoption of these and similar fascist programs. Now, Kevorkian and the Oregon rationing plan are just parts of a wide-ranging, aggressive assault on human life whose success can be directly attributed to the deliberate and systematic destruction of Western values, which the other speakers have discussed. Since the late 1970s, when the Right to Die movement began to get off the ground in earnest, it has become increasingly clear that the policymaking elite in the United States has made a decision to deal with the economic crisis which it created through its own greed and stupidity, not by adopting growth-producing economic policies, but by slating whole sections of the population for extermination. The poor, the unemployed, the mentally ill are now all considered useless eaters. You need only go to any city in the country and see the millions of people who were forced to live on the streets in the most squalid conditions, unable to get shelter, food, or medical care, to realize how true this is. Now, America's elderly, as a group, are slated to be one of the major groups who will be sacrificed by the financial oligarchy to its god of usury. Richard Lamb, the former Democratic governor of Colorado, may have shocked many people back in 1984 when he said that the elderly have a duty to die and get out of the way of the younger generation. But he was only enunciating publicly what had by then become the behind-the-scenes consensus of U.S. policymaking circles. Over the past few years, there has been an endless flood of Lamb-style propaganda, claiming that the U.S. spends far too much on the elderly through entitlement programs, that's the official term given to Social Security and Medicare, and insisting that if we don't start putting the squeeze on those over 65, there won't be enough resources for the young. The population is being inundated with the message that killing off grandma is the politically correct thing to do. If resources are limited, the argument goes, it's better to put Granny on an ice floe than it is to let Junior starve. If little Johnny is to have a decent life, then Grandpa must give up his. In 1987, Daniel Callahan, who is a leading bioethicist and director of the influential Hastings Center, wrote a book called Setting Limits, which should give you a sense of the mentality driving this attack on the elderly. Callahan maintained that there is a natural lifespan of approximately 75 years, which is complete nonsense, and said that the government should not spend 1 penny on any life-extending medical treatment for people over that age. To do so, he said, would both violate nature and, far more important, would be too expensive for society. If the young are to flourish, Callahan wrote, then the old should step aside in an active way. The acceptance of their aging and death would be a principal stimulus to do this. Government, he went on, and I'm quoting Callahan now, cannot be expected to bear without restraint the growing social and economic costs of health care for the elderly. It must draw lines. Our common social obligation to the elderly, he said, is only to help them live out a natural lifespan. That is, the government is obliged to provide deliberately life-extending health care only to the age which is necessary to achieve that goal, which in Callahan's view is about 75. He then went on to say that he believes that an age-based standard for the termination of life-extending treatment would be legitimate, and that the meaning and significance of life for the elderly themselves is best founded on a sense of limits to health care. That same year, Peter Peterson, who's a very prominent Wall Street banker and currently the chairman of the board of the New York Council on Foreign Relations, published a book called On Borrowed Time, which advanced many of the same arguments as Callahan. Peterson, whose former business partner, Roger Altman, now serves in the number 2 post at the U.S. Treasury Department, has since gone on to play a pivotal role in shaping the debate over the fate of the nation's elderly. In particular, Peterson has attempted to pit the young against the old, lying that there are limited resources, and insisting that the only way for the young to survive is by limiting the elderly's consumption. In a speech to the American Assembly in 1991, Peterson blamed what he called vast entitlement programs for the elderly for the ballooning growth in the U.S. budget deficit. He claimed that U.S. national interest is, quote, best served by programs that direct public resources toward investment and youth, not toward consumption and age. And he said further that to ensure that the right redirection of resources is made, the U.S. should move toward progressive taxation of Social Security benefits, which the Clinton administration has recently proposed, and adopt other measures which would have the direct effect of driving up the death rate among those over 65. To a large degree, the 1992 presidential election campaign was structured to set the stage for the implementation of some form of the program that Callahan and Peterson advocate. Several of the candidates, most notably Ross Perot and Paul Tsongas, played especially important roles in this regard, emphasizing repeatedly the supposed need to slash Social Security and Medicare in order to free up resources for investment in the young. To bolster these contentions, a number of leading establishment think tanks issued guidelines for the incoming administration recommending the same lethal policies. One of the most chilling of these was a report published last fall by the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, which argued for massive cuts in the federal budget especially in Medicare and Medicaid. The report complained that approximately 30% of total Medicare dollars are spent on patients in the last year of their lives, and warned that comprehensive health care reform will not be complete without a social consensus on care for the terminally ill. Translated into pure English, this means that the elderly and terminally ill must be hurried to their graves for the sake of deficit reduction. Now, this Nazi-style campaign against the elderly has accelerated tremendously in the last 6 months. President Clinton's budget not only calls for huge cuts in Medicare, it also increases the tax on Social Security benefits for retirees with an income of $25,000 a year or more. Now, that is hardly a princely sum, especially for an elderly person who frequently spends hundreds of dollars a month on prescriptions alone. During the same period, our good friend Peter Peterson has personally established several supposedly grassroots groups to lobby for deep reductions in Social Security and Medicare as part of an across-the-board austerity program for the U.S. One of these groups is the Concord Coalition, which Peterson co-founded along with Paul Tsongas, former Senator Warren Rudman, and Washington insider attorney Lloyd Cutler. Not only have all these individuals been instrumental in promoting the very economic policies that drove the United States into its current collapse, they have also been in the vanguard of the campaign to reduce Americans' living standards to prop up their bankrupt financial system. Last year, for example, Warren Rudman called for a one-party dictatorship in the United States on the grounds that this would be the most efficient way to implement austerity. And Lloyd Cutler, who was White House counsel to Jimmy Carter, advocates eliminating the U.S. constitutional system for precisely the same reason. Now, the Concord Coalition is bad enough, but far more insidious is another of Peterson's so-called grassroots groups, Lead or Leave. This is a group of bloodthirsty yuppie punks which Peterson, Ross Perot, Lee Iacocca, and whoa, Lee Iacocca, and some other moneybags set up last summer for the express purpose of fomenting what they call a generational war of the young against the old. And you know who's on the board of Lead or Leave? Well, Richard Lamb, of course, as well as Massachusetts Governor William Weld, the dope lobby asset who helped orchestrate the judicial lynching of Lyndon LaRouche and his associates and is now being touted as a Republican presidential candidate in the next elections. Now, it's quite clear from Lead or Leave's propaganda that they are consciously intended to replicate the Hitler Youth movement, which campaigned relentlessly for the extermination of Germany's elderly and mentally and physically handicapped. Lead or Leave is going to the very colleges and universities which, like Stanford, are teaching students that it is politically incorrect to hold human life sacred, and telling these same students that their futures depend on stopping their greedy and no longer productive parents and grandparents from hogging resources. Lead or Leave is trying to enlist young people who have already been softened up by years of miseducation into a shock troop against the new enemy, their own mothers and fathers. The two main frontmen for this neo-Nazi operation are Rob Nelson and John Cowan, and I don't think it will come as much of a surprise to learn that Cowan used to work for Mel Levine, one of the ADL's biggest boosters in Congress, or that his father is active in the California ADL, which is yet more proof of the fascist nature of the Anti-Defamation League. At the behest of Peterson and their other Wall Street backers, Nelson and Cowan are trying to whip up a lynch mob against those over 65 using the most demagogic methods imaginable. Last month, Ted Koppel's Nightline devoted a whole program to these murderous creatures, where they ranted that Social Security is an unfair and unsound program and a generational scam. They charged that the younger generation is getting ripped off and said that Lead or Leave's war against the elderly is this younger generation's Vietnam. The establishment media has been giving the group a tremendous amount of publicity over the last few months. In addition to Nightline, they've been written up in the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other establishment papers, and were featured recently on the cover of U.S. News and World Report. In an op-ed they wrote for the New York Times in February, Nelson and Cowan called for reducing Social Security cost of living increases and raising the retirement age from 65 to at least 70, among other measures. Older voters and politicians be warned, they said. Younger Americans aren't going to let you continue destroying our country. Well, our country is being destroyed by the prevalence of the kind of satanic mentality exhibited by Lead or Leave. Lead or Leave could not have existed 30 years ago, and they certainly could never have gotten away with their vicious propaganda. They are the children of the Aquarian conspiracy's paradigm shift. They are the result of America's failure to defend Western civilization against the concerted battle waged against it. And their existence should serve as fair warning that we must mobilize our forces to defeat Satan and his Freemasonic minions, first and foremost by getting Lyndon LaRouche out of jail. We do have the capacity to do this. It is possible. But if we don't fight, the United States will become a hell on earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. We now have approximately 40 minutes for questions and discussion. As people are lining up at the microphones or considering what questions or comments they would like to make, I have one announcement, which is the following. All Muslims, please come to the Hunter Room at 12:30 for prayer. And as people are considering questions and comments, I would like to use this opportunity also to have the messages of greetings read that we have received from Michael Billington and Rochelle Asher. I would like to ask John Asher to come forward. I would also like to ask Margaret Greenspan to come forward. Gail Billington is right now visiting Mike in jail, so she will not be able to read the message, but Mike's sister, Margaret, will read it. And as they are coming forward to read those messages, I would like to do one other thing and make a simple point, which is that one of the essential purposes of the legal terror and barbarism and assaults against our organization, besides putting LaRouche in jail, which has been of fundamental importance to our enemy, to try to destroy him, get him out of the way, that another one of the purposes of this operation obviously has been to dismantle us as an institution, the organization, the movement, the international movement, which LaRouche is chiefly responsible for creating. And among those weapons that have been used in this effort has been an attempt to terrorize the members of this movement with exemplary barbaric treatment of those who have faced trials and have been convicted. Perhaps the most shocking and scandalous is that of Mike Billington's with his 77-year sentence, which he is currently serving. It is by no means the only one. In fact, it's so far from the only one that I want to use the occasion. This might risk a mass movement here, but I would like to ask all of those who were indicted in the New York cases, the Alexandria case, and the Virginia cases to please stand up. I was going to have you come forward, but that's going to take too much time. But if you could stand up, I think it's actually very interesting for everyone to see how many of us there are. And I think it's safe to say that I speak for all of us when I say that we are proud of our convictions. So, Margaret?
This is from Michael Billington, who's at the Nottoway Correctional Center in Burkeville, Virginia. As I write this message to you, all from the Virginia prison system, a young man is being electrocuted in a nearby Virginia penitentiary after the judicial system from Mary Sue Terry to the Supreme Court of the United States refused even to honor his plea for a hearing to determine whether or not frying a man slowly to death constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the U.S. Constitution. This serves as yet another gruesome piece of evidence that the Constitution of this nation no longer governs the actions or the decision-making processes of our governing bodies. If we are to succeed in changing that, then we must change the American people to make them see in mankind and in themselves more than the unrestrained passions and greed which dominate popular culture today. if people cannot locate in themselves the reflection of the creative power of the universe, then how can they find the compassion necessary to stand up against the worldwide atrocities of our new dark age? To help mankind find that living image of God in themselves is to think like St. Augustine, like Cusa, like Leibniz, or like Lyndon LaRouche. These past 6 months in the Virginia Gulag have been spent with a Chinese scholar and statesman from the 12th century, Chu Si, who led a Confucian Renaissance that saved China from a Taoist Dark Age. I shared the joy that Leibniz once felt in his own discovery of this great man's work 300 years ago. That Chu Si, in fact, did think like Cusa, further confirming Leibniz's faith in the unity of God's creation. What is proven is that every human child has a capacity to be a sage, to live in the imitation of Christ, or as Confucius said, to face the Lord of heaven all day. This is true both because each child is blessed with a divine spark of reason, which gives him or her the equal potential to participate in the unfolding creation, but also because each child from any culture that has survived up to this time, can find somewhere in the roots of that culture the reflection of the vision of man as being in the image of God, as was most beautifully expressed in the Christian Renaissance in Europe. Of course, that child can also find in that culture, any culture, the reflection of the opposite view of man, like that which brought us the rock, drug, sex counterculture of today and the Scottish Rite of Albert Pike. What is required is leaders who know the difference. So if each of you will decide to become a sage, then we can get Lynn out of prison, along with a few other fellows and ladies, and we can get down to business. So I hope to see you soon.
Recently, I was reading from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he said to his supporters, quote, "Remember, sometimes it has to get awfully dark before you see the stars." Well, when the supreme sovereign of the Scottish Rite feels forced in his own name to attack Lynn as the most important enemy of the Freemasons of the world, I think that not only will the stars begin to shine, but more likely something on the scale of the explosion of the asteroid belt is about to occur. Please know that even though I wish I were there physically, I am there in spirit, fighting every minute of every day. While I'll leave the preaching to Reverend Bevel, I want to leave you with a quote from Matthew. "For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul?" I know how hard we have all been fighting, but in that spirit, may we vow to fight even harder to get Lynn out now, especially for the children of Bosnia and the millions of children suffering all over the world. With love, Rochelle Asher, Virginia Correctional Center for Women, Goochland, Virginia. Thank you.
I think Reverend Bevel's got some competition. And I think it's fairly clear that from the two statements that have been read, no matter what the efforts of the enemy to destroy and demoralize and frighten our membership, with the kind of leadership in courage and leadership intellectually that Mike and Shelley are helping to provide, there is no question but that we will not be defeated. and we thank them for that. We can begin with the first question.
Okay, my name is Jim Cleary from New Jersey. I have to explain a little bit before I ask the question. My brother just recently has become involved with something that, from what he has explained, sounds to me is a cultish type of thing in New York City and Manhattan. They call themselves the New School, and it has a philosophy branch and it has a economics branch. And from what he described of it to me, it's almost like where the individuals involved are brainwashing themselves. But just recently, he said that it's a branch of the London School of Economics. So I'm just wondering if anybody in their research has come across either of these two operations.
Is anyone going to admit to know anything about this? I have to admit that I went to grad school there for one day. One day. That was it.
Never heard of it. The one thing that differentiates the New School, of course, is that the New School was set up, modeled on, in part, the London School of Economics, and it was set up by a group of emigre scholars from starting in 1933 after Hitler came to power, which meant that a lot of the people who were involved in the creation of the New School and its departments were literally the Frankfurt School and their close collaborators and, Southwest German neo-Kantians and all manner of really crazy people. I think it's important to stress, however, that this is everywhere. What we've been describing in some of the work on political correctness that you've read in Fidelio and New Federalist, and we'll hear tomorrow at the Deconstruction panel, I think it's important to realize that although we can highlight places like the New School and Stanford University and places like that this stuff is everywhere, and its spore goes down to the grade schools, which is why you're talking about having to create a renaissance to counteract it. You cannot take these things on a molecular basis. The New School was a very bad place. Most higher education institutions that you can go to today or send your children to and spend a lot of money sending them there are comparable.
Yes, next.
My name is Gene Roberts. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, the home of Jack Kevorkian. Supposedly, a poll was taken in Michigan. 55% of the Michiganians are in favor of what Jack Kevorkian's doing. But on a bigger plane that I've never heard addressed directly in all my years of coming to conferences is the fact that one of the biggest groups of social pessimists is the variations of the Baptist, Southern Baptists, and other so-called fundamental Christian groups that teach that we're in the last days. And then you ask them, well, how do you know we're in the last days? And they say, because things in the last days are supposed to get worse and worse, and that's what's happening. And then you say, well, why are things supposed to get worse and worse? And they say, well, because we're in the last days. It's a circular reasoning. And I wonder, in our organizing, how can we address this kind of horrendous social pessimist it is the largest evangelical denomination in the United States.
Jimmy Carter has left the Southern Baptists because they're being taken over by us. This was in the Scottish Rite Journal. They are in a pandemonium. That means when hell is too noisy for themselves to think. There is every evidence that the enemy is fixated on this statue and related developments like the fight going on in the Baptists in a kind of mental paralysis. But what we should say here is that this age now that we're in is not only the Dark Age, but it is also the beginning of the Renaissance. We are in the beginning of the Renaissance. Right? Now when you see the strategy of tension being carried out by the P2 and by various condominiums against Germany and the wars and the terrorism at the World Trade Center, this is a strategy of insanity, of distraction. Reason has its own action, its own agenda. It's not only a program for developing Europe, Lynn's program, but the continual intervention of our program and of our interventions against the enemy has its own shaping of this age, which will be seen later to be the beginning of the Renaissance. Lynn talked about his interventions with the SDI, with Operation Juarez, and with the Triangle program, leading to a tremendous spread of our influence and of our organization in Europe and in South America and in the United States, and leading to tremendous consequences that have already taken place in the world. Our counterattack, for example, even at Stanford University, we go in there and we immediately turn the place around. Reverend Bevel's statement on this is totally key. The earth is the Lord's. It doesn't belong to Satan at all, and wherever we go, we immediately transform the situation with our organizing. We did this with the New Left back when we had only a few people back in the 1960s, where the government was, or the Ford Foundation, so forth, were setting up environmentalism and the New Left. We retarded environmentalism by a number of years by attacking the thing at its birth, and we killed off the New Left. And they've been retarded ever since. That's right. I want to mention, though, in continuing this attack, where we might be going in the future. For example, the Scottish Rite Masons have another front that they operate on, which is child care, and particularly the care of mentally disturbed and otherwise handicapped children, and also the care of schizophrenics. You should note that the center of the neo-Nazi movement, which has a lot to do with the Scottish Rite Masons, it has two centers. One is Nebraska, and the other is San Francisco. These are the two centers of world neo-Nazism. When you begin to attack this phenomena of somebody carrying out a crime or a series of crimes that so directly affect the family, the thousands or hundreds of thousands of children disappearing, it's obvious to everybody that this is going to be a powerful attack on our part, and that the Masons are really in trouble. Just to give you two examples of this, we recently found out that the International Order of the Job's Daughters, which is the teenage girls section of Freemasonry, is headquartered in Omaha, Nebraska. The AZA, the International Teenage Boys section of B'nai B'rith, is also headquartered in Omaha, Nebraska. Father Flanagan's Boys Town was set up by those people, that is the Masons and the B'nai B'rith. And if you read the Franklin story from Nebraska about ritual abuse and Satanism, you see what is something that we have the power to take down in a completely nonlinear way. So in talking to the people about the last days, it's clear to many people in the Baptists that we are in the last days of the Masons.
Yes, next question.
Yeah, this is for, I'm Tony Hadley from Philadelphia. This is for Mike Minicino. On the issue of the television itself, on how it operates, because I've noticed even when giving videos of Lynn, where people were very interested in the content of what he's saying. Even when the video is over, I still kind of see sort of a stare or a glaze in people's eyes. You know, that there's something in the television itself. And I believe that the television could have been used for good, or should be used for good. But I was wondering, have you done any research on how the actual TV functions? I believe it actually flashes 60 cycles or 60 times a second or something like that. But I was wondering if you have done any research on the actual functioning of the TV itself, or the picture.
I thought Kissinger was the only one who flashed 60 times a second.
There's a lot of work which has been done. It is well known that television will reduce your brainwave patterns. It's absolutely given. Any form of television, once you get into it, your brainwave patterns, which just start to go down, which means you are entertained. You're entertained by television. Television is, it's very important you bring it up with Lynn. That's a necessary evil, insofar as there are necessary evils. If Lynn were able to were out of prison and had lots of money to freely go all over the place, we probably would de-emphasize television. The things that, television is not an art form. Television is not art. It has no pretension to art. I mean, a lot of people say it has art. Films, you can't reduce art in a two-dimensional medium that moves and where the director is telling you the focus, the positioning, the perspective, and everything else. There's no, the whole medium is designed to reduce your engagement with the concepts that are involved. And yes, you're absolutely right. Putting Lynn and LaRouche on television is something I really hate doing. And I'm the guy who's responsible for it. And the more I use graphics and stuff like that, that's more entertaining to you and easier for you to understand, as opposed to seeing Lynn for, like we used to do in '84, where you just would talk for 25 minutes. The more that makes it more accessible to more people, and the more it fulfills the true role of television, the more it is in fact reducing your brain power as you're watching it. So that is absolutely the case. If you want more information on that, it definitely does. I can give it to you privately, but there is definitely a lot of clinical studies which have been done that prove conclusively that this stuff, even on a technical basis, makes you stupid.
Yes, next.
I'm going to ask a question after I make a quick statement in response to what Shelley Asher said through John. When I was a student at Howard University about a year ago, I came to the Baltimore local and didn't know who Shelley was, and sat down with her, and I thought I was really radical black militant. And I wasn't supposed to like white ladies or anything, right? And then Shelley, everyone knows, is physically beautiful. She's a beautiful lady. And then she was about exponentially more radical and militant than I was. And I said, something's wrong here. It totally threw me off. The point I'm making is that she really touched my soul that day. And she was going to jail in a couple of days. And it transformed me. And go back to something that Dr. Aleem said at Morgan State. He said about Reverend Bevel, he said, you couldn't pay this man back for all that he's done for you. And that's the thing, like with Shelley, when she touched my soul that day, it's like you can't really pay people back for that. The only appropriate response to that is to give your life to the idea or to the process that they're fighting for. Now I want to turn this into a confession, a church. I haven't been doing as much as I could be doing, I know, to free Lynn. But I'm going to tell you, it's like what Reverend Bevel said. He's giving cutting-edge, state-of-the-art theological science, this lecture last night. there are no evil people. The only reason that I didn't fight as hard as I could to free Lynn is because I didn't really understand who Lynn really is. And attending this conference, it has totally reshaped the geometry of my thinking. Talking with Phil Valenti about the farm situation, on how this connects with, you know, the whole world picture. And then hearing Mike give this really in-depth analysis of the political correctness and what that all means. And then hearing Mr. Steinberg talk about the drugs. And this gives me an idea of who Lynn is, because he's producing people who are effective fighters. Now, and the only way to solve these problems is to be that efficient, based on this principle of potential relative population density, that scientific breakthroughs, like Reverend Bevel says, which are just as exact in the sociological world as they are in the physical world, that Lynn makes in terms of politics, economics, increases the ability of the world to grow, of the population. And so I'm saying that since I understand this, now I heard you guys, the way you built the organizations, you all guys up there used to be pretty radical and rambunctious. And I'm saying, like, as a young guy, I know what my responsibility is. And the point is this, is that, look, you know, and in truth, actually everything has to shut down until Lynn goes free. Everything. I don't care what the hell you are doing in your life. All you people who are here visiting from schools, it's obvious that the people here, the wisdom that we're getting here it doesn't even compare. It's a different species of the academic crap that we get fed in schools. So the point is, you know, why would you go back and lick up your vomit after today? Join the movement full time. We need to shut down every campus. And the same thing for everyone who has a job. I mean, what are you trying to get? What are you trying to get? You need money? Join the phone team. Raise some money. Okay, that's basically what I wanted to say. No.
No question. This man has talked to Shelley Asher.
My quick question is to Mike. I just wanted to know what you meant by there are no polls.
Let me just answer your first comment. The way we built this organization, in the very, very beginning, as you said, there were some unnamed radicals who I never knew myself personally. And what they would do is, using the same kind of concepts that Lynn outlines on the subject of metaphor, they would choose ironic points on college campuses, issues that were just exploitable enough to get a bit of a fight going so that we could invite Linda LaRouche on campus. And Lynn would talk about the meaning of life. And that's how we recruited a whole bunch of people. And that's the way you're going to recruit a whole bunch of people is today. You're going to create issues on the campus, and then you're going to invite Lynn on campus. And he's going to talk about the meaning of life. And until we can get him out there physically, I ask you to all perform the act of consubstantiation or transubstantiation, however you want to call it, that you have to recreate Lynn on the campus, not talking about a specific issue, but about the meaning of life, which is what Lynn used to do and recruit people, because that's what college students, if they've got a brain left in their head, want to know about. Now, on the question of polls, total fraud. If you listen to a poll, you believe a poll, you deserve everything you get. I actually did something that was very obvious. I read the textbooks, and I know how it's done. Take this room, divide it, bring people at random to fill up the seats in the entire place. Divide it in two right here, okay? You have the right side of the room, you have the left side of the room. This is the actual textbook case with the actual figures. Each side of the room gets a questionnaire. 2 different questionnaires. 2 questions on the questionnaires. The second question is the same. On the right side of the room, the second question, and on the left side of the room, the second question reads, a married woman who would like to limit the size of her family should be allowed to have an abortion. There is nothing up my sleeve. This side of the room, the right side of the room, 55% will answer no. This side of the room, 55% will answer yes. How do you do it? First question. On this side of the room, which is the so-called pro-life side, the first question reads, who do you think will win the American League pennant? Some neutral question. Okay? This side of the room, the first question reads, a woman who had, no, excuse me, I've got that backwards. This is the pro-life group. Your first question reads, a woman who discovers that her child will be severely retarded should be allowed to have an abortion. People will answer 55% yes to that. But having answered 55% yes on the question of severe retardation, we'll see that abortion for the purposes of family limitation is trivial, and therefore will vote against it. And that's how you will only know the second question. You just manipulate it by the various questions. I can produce a 5 to 10% differentiation by saying the government should allow versus the government should forbid. That will automatically produce 5 to 10% differentiation. Everybody votes against the government shall forbid. I can produce a 3 to 5% variation by using the word welfare versus public assistance. This is an art form, and the people who do it are artists, and that's what they're paid big money to do.
We will not take a poll on when we are going to have a lunch break. It will happen in approximately 10 minutes. So let's proceed with questions and answers as rapidly as possible.
Dave Starks, Philadelphia. I have two quick questions. One, with the man that was doing the thing on money laundering. I just wondered if you could elaborate more on the connection with sports. And also for Mr. Chaikin, I was wondering if you, since we had protested the Albert Pike statue, is there any protest in the works, or what do you feel about the issue concerning the Confederate flag for the southern states?
I'll answer by a fairly simple example. You're a drug runner, and you've got millions and millions of dollars in cash being built up in suitcases and warehouses, wherever, and you want to find some effective way to use it. Best thing to have available to you are large places where tens and at sometimes hundreds of thousands of people all go and pay $5 or $10 or $20, and I probably assume now $50 or $100 per person to get in the door to attend some professional football game or something like that. Drop another $20 or $30 maybe per person, slugging down beer and eating hot dogs and things like that. And there is not an IRS agent hanging out there in the cashier's booth looking at how much money has come into the till by the so-called legitimate entertainment aspect of what's gone on there. And so it was created very much with the idea of not only the cultural subversion, but of creating a untraceable facility through which the easiest thing in the world is to slip a few extra $100,000 or a few $1 million into the combined cash take. And then the secret, and one of the reasons why this old-fashioned method of money laundering was so distasteful, somewhere along the way you might have to declare that income as part of the income of the stadium or the gambling casino, and you might have to pay taxes on it. So in that sense, it was not only a relatively small scale and inefficient way of laundering the kinds of billions and now trillions of dollars in illegal money that we want to cycle through the economy. It was also something that involved, on at least a small scale, the very distasteful thing of having to part with some of that money by kicking it over to Uncle Sam. Now, take a look at the U.S. economy today. Take a look at sports figures. You've got professional gladiators, basically, earning salaries of $1, $2, maybe $3 million a clip. And this is really chump change, more an inducement and a seduction to get a lot of other people thinking that the way to succeed in life is to become pumped up with steroids and become a jock, rather than do something with your brain and be a human being in the full sense of the word that Reverend Bevel and Lynn have talked about it over the last 2 days. So you've got a proliferation of this stuff all over the economy. You used to have, 8 professional baseball teams. Now you've got, 20 or 30 of them. This is the growth industry. This is the direction the economy is going. Now, that's not to say that physical strenuous exercise is bad. Going back to the time of the Platonic Academy in Athens, it was recognized that strenuous physical exercise, physical training, is of importance to human beings. You ought to be healthy. But sports used to be thought of from the standpoint of man demonstrating his superiority over nature, taking on a challenging task and accomplishing it. There's a race that took place last week in Alaska, which I think I've thought about a little bit. It's an interesting example. It's called the Iditarod. I was up there a while back and I read some things about it. It was set up in 1957 because there was a big storm in Nome, Alaska, and there was an outbreak of some disease and there was no medicine and there was no way to get into that town. And what happened was that the medicine was available in Anchorage, so somebody hitched up a dog sled team and trekked 1,200 miles to carry the medicine to Nome, Alaska in order to save the people there. And it was a combined effort by a human being, a skilled athlete, very skilled, and a team of trained dogs, and they accomplished something that was a life-saving accomplishment. That challenge to defeat nature and do something for human life is the example of what sportsmanship really was in the traditional Republican sense. Hold that up against the image of Hollywood, sports, the television entertainment industry, legalized gambling. There is now a casino in Las Vegas called the Excalibur, which is designed on a Freemasonic theme of King Arthur's court in the Knights of the Round Table. And talk about professional sports. In the middle of the gambling casino hall, which is about 3 acres in one area, you have a dirt ring in which 3 times a day while the gambling is going on, there are jousting matches, and they've got everything but the lions and Christians there in the middle of the auditorium. So hold up those 2 images as fairly good examples of what the difference is between gangsterism encouraging bestiality versus something that is by way of physical exercise demonstrating concretely man's superiority over all other forms of nature.
On the Confederate flag, we are ecumenical, and we've really undercut the Confederate concept by turning it around away from a geographical problem. There are members of the Ku Klux Klan or supporters of the Ku Klux Klan who are perfectly good people and who think that they're fighting against, they're rebelling against Washington. The Confederate flag itself is the Scotch cross from the British flag, right, with some Southern stars on the thing, right, the stars and bars. But the point is that this is not a Southern phenomenon. Despite the culture of the South over decades from slavery, for example, in the Mark Calney's work, he talked about Breckinridge at the end of the war conducting the father of D.W. Griffith, I guess it was, to begin his career. Breckinridge was one of these Scottish Rite founders of the secession movement. This is a little clique of people based on British Freemasonry. So what we want to do here is to focus on flipping this entire debate, which we are doing very, very dramatically. We should have, just like we've started and people who think like we started in the Baptists, we should have among the Jewish synagogues over the next, I would say, 3 to 6 months, a furious debate going on about the ADL. So this is the kind of flip on these supposed categories of humanity, North and South, white and black, that we have to put the monkey wrench in and completely destroy. Thank you.
Okay, next.
Hi.
We will take these last 4 questions, and that's it. So proceed.
Hi. My name is Kelvin Lard from University of Buffalo, pre-law student, pre-law major, and political science major. And I've got a question for Mr. Steinberg and I believe Mrs. Klinsky. Yes, I've been told that Bank of Credit Commerce International specifically targeted inner cities for drugs. And I wanted to know if you had any knowledge of that, that Clark Clifford and his colleagues specifically targeted the inner cities. And also for Eileen, I believe, could you elaborate on what do you mean by the miseducation of young people? And my last question is, I'm head of the political science club at University of Buffalo, and students and I have been trying to get involved with this movement. And there's no literature on the Buffalo chapter, and I was wondering, why is that? There's no phone numbers, there's no contacts, and could you help us out a little bit?
Are you volunteering? Okay, there we go. We got our Buffalo chapter. Kathleen?
Well, on miseducation, I think a good example is this rainbow curriculum that I talked about earlier, which was developed for grades as early as the first grade. And what it is supposedly this multicultural program. It teaches that everything goes, there's nothing right, there's nothing wrong. It prevents children from developing any sense of values or any sense of morality. As I mentioned, one of the books in it is Heather Has Two Mommies, and there are a bunch of other similar titles, George Has Two Daddies and stuff like this. In the debate that went on in New York City over this rainbow curriculum, parents got up and said, look, you're teaching our kids how to put on condoms, but you're not teaching them calculus or anything that is required for them to actually function at a human level. If you look at the political, at Stanford, for example, in the Executive Intelligence Review, we did a recent cover story in which Bob Ingram goes through some of the curricula changes that have taken place at Stanford since 1988, and they're really horrendous. You can't create a human society if you tell people that there are limits to resources, if this is the basis of your outlook, this is the basis of your training of children. Because what you're telling them is that there is a limit to the human mind, that the human mind and human creativity are finite. Well, that means that you're dooming society. Yet this is the basis of the educational system in the United States over the last 20 or 30 years. We've written a number of, issued a number of reports and other things which you might find useful. One of them we put out 5 or 6 years ago on the libertarian conspiracy, which goes into much greater depth on some of these topics, and I think you'd find that useful.
Let me just say something real quickly about the other part of your question in terms of BCCI. It may be the case that BCCI was involved in that kind of activity. I certainly wouldn't put it past them. They own many, many banks inside the U.S., and it could be the case. But I think the more important point to realize is that people should have gotten suspicious when the cover story in Time magazine exposed a bank for financing drug money laundering and terrorism. Time magazine called it an Arab bank, and the implication, even before this most recent round of propaganda against Islam, was that somehow or other you had a bunch of sleazy sheikhs from the Middle East who were coming into the United States and robbing this country blind. Well, do a little bit of background research and you find out that BCCI was owned by the Rothschild family. You haven't read about that in Time magazine or in the pages of the Wall Street Journal very much. So I would just say, number one, that the BCCI case in and of itself was somewhat blown out of proportion to create the completely fraudulent idea that there's good banks and bad banks. And good banks are the ones that should be saved, and bad banks like BCCI, associated with dirty oil Arab sheikhs, should be shut down, and somehow or other we're dealing with the problem. There's not a clean bank in the United States. There's not an inner city in the United States where virtually every street corner bank is not in one way or other helping out on the destruction of those areas through drugs. So it's a far more basic and fundamental issue on the table here. Our entire banking system, through the process I discussed earlier this morning, has been decimated, and we must start from scratch to put it back together from square one, to reestablish national banking, to create a new generation, I shudder at the thought, of honest accountants who can at least go in and do at least the initial auditing to figure out just how much money was stolen before they go out and get productive jobs. So it's the banking system as a whole that must be torn down and restructured, starting with the Fed, back to national banking and American system economics, and nothing short of that is going to solve any of the kinds of problems that we've been identifying here today.
Yes, next.
Yes, I'm Brian Wilson. I'm from Seattle. I wanted to direct my question to Mr. Steinberg. When he had the proposal for the 0.1% tax on derivative markets, I was wondering maybe it would be better for 1% tax on that. And they use half that money for the state government so they can actually have a budget.
You know, Lynn has a tremendous knack for how to turn the flank. And you start talking about big taxes like 1 whole percentage point, and people are going to start to see, gee, that's too much. This guy's in favor of more taxes on us. You know, what difference does 1/10 of 1% make? So, you know, let's just go ahead and do it at that level. As I say, we're talking about generating new revenues based on taxing parasites of approximately, and this is a minimal guesstimate, $1 billion a day. The consequence of that is that these people are going to go running out of that business, and we're going to start drying up exactly these kinds of parasitical, usurious, derivative, illegal operations that have captured and destroyed our economy. That's really the critical thing. You want to push the idea of a 1% tax? Let's discuss it out. I don't have any problem with that either.
Yes, next.
I would like to make a proposal that since this program has emphasized, in effect, a celebration of life and is opposed to the philosophy of pessimism, that you consider a book of poetry which would celebrate life. And I have an example because I think it deals in great part with some of the things that Kathleen Klinetsky was talking about the attack on the elderly or the infirm. And it's very brief, but I think it will support my question better if I read it. It's by a black poet from Detroit named Dudley Randall, and it appeared in a privately published book, The Lotus Press in Detroit, 1981. And it's to the mercy killers. If ever mercy move you murder me, I pray you, kindly killer, let me live. Never conspire with death to set me free, but let me know such life as pain can give. Even though I be a clot, an aching clench, a stub, a stump, a butt, a scab, a knob, a screaming pain, a putrefying stench, still let me live, so long as life shall throb, even though I turn such traitor to myself as beg to die. Do not accomplice me, even though I seem not human, a mute self of glucose, bottled blood, machinery to swell the lung and pump the heart. Even so, do not put out my life. Let me still glow. My suggestion is that there be considered a book of poetry that celebrates life right from the earliest, including the Psalms and the Proverbs right up to modern times, of the best of poetry that celebrates life.
And I think it would be worthy of publication, and it would be unique because I don't think anyone else would publish such a book.
Just one brief announcement before the final question, which is, will Denise Henderson come to the front of the podium to meet Mel Klinetsky? Next question.
Okay. It's more, what I have to say is more of a statement than a question in regards to the so-called Rainbow Coalition. The original purpose of this, which was really not the Rainbow Coalition, but the curriculum of inclusion, which the purpose was to correct the omissions and incorrect statements of history that were taught to the children. The people originally who originated this idea, I know two of them, did not originally put in about homosexuals. This was not to establish people to love and get used to the life of homosexuals and gays and so on. It was to teach young children tolerance. Somehow, Mr. Fernandez, who was already run out of another state because he ruined their educational system, was gotten to, and certain people who did not want the Rainbow Coalition instituted got to him, and of 400 pages of the curriculum of inclusion, 2 paragraphs were added by people who were not the originators of the curriculum of inclusion, because they decided, what can we do to wipe this out? What can we add that people would not like it? And that was, they preyed on homophobic people, people who had problems with the sexual aspect. Teaching the children of condoms was only to be started in the 7th grade, and as many of us know, there are children, 10 and 11-year-olds, who have babies anyway. And I don't want people to really get the idea that that is all that the so-called Rainbow Coalition, which was not Rainbow Curriculum, which was not the original title or purpose of this program.
I mean, I'd just like to say a few things. There's nothing wrong with tolerance. I mean, we should all be tolerant, but it depends on what you're tolerant of. I mean, I don't think that kids should be given condoms in the schools. I don't think it's a proper function of the school. I think that children of the age of 10 or 11 have children because of the cultural pessimism that pervades the society. They don't really have hope. I mean, I think as you see with this Norplant, the push for Norplant in Baltimore and other places, that this is a policy of deliberate genocide. And I don't think we should tolerate that. I don't think we should tolerate teaching kids that environmentalism is right, or that zero growth is right, or that if you're over 65, you should drop dead. I don't think that's tolerance.